I often think about what it meant to step onto a football field in the 1920s or 1930s. Not the polished stadiums we know today. Not the carefully manicured turf under billion-dollar lights. Back then, it was dirt, cinder, and patches of grass torn up by cleats that carried men who were half-starved, half-broken, and yet determined to fight for a game that gave them almost nothing in return. When I read the old accounts, when I imagine the grainy black-and-white photographs come to life, I realize that the National Football League was never born glamorous. It was born violent. And that violence was not incidental, it was the currency of survival. In the early days of professional football, players lived with the expectation that their bodies were disposable. The pay was meager, often just a few dollars a game. A broken nose might mean you could not eat for a week. A shattered leg might mean the end of not only your career, but your chance at earning a living. And still, they played. They played because there was no safety net, no promise of insurance, no union to protect them. They played because to walk away from the game was to return to factory lines, coal mines, or unemployment lines during the Depression. I think about the men who strapped on thin leather helmets, barely more than padded caps. No face masks, no mouthguards, no modern pads. Just flesh, bone, and willpower colliding in a sport where rules were loose and enforcement was looser. Opponents punched in the trenches. Fingers were gouged in the pile. Players emerged from scrums with blood in their mouths and teeth missing. And the game simply went on. Coaches encouraged it. Fans cheered it. Owners looked the other way. There are stories that sound almost mythic now. Men who played with concussions so severe they could not recall their own names by the final whistle. Players who had ribs broken on one play only to be sent back in on the next series because there were no substitutions. It was an era when weakness was punished and silence was demanded. Pain was not just tolerated, it was a rite of passage. In 1933, Chicago Bears guard Joe Theismann, who was also a practicing physician, once described the brutal toll of the game. He called it controlled mayhem, a phrase that still echoes a century later. And he knew firsthand. Theismann sewed up his own teammates on the sidelines because medical staff were scarce. And the game could not stop. Imagine that, for a moment, a player, still sweating and bleeding from the field, taking out needle and thread to stitch another man's flesh, so the team could keep 11 bodies in uniform. But this was not extraordinary in its time. It was ordinary. The brutality was compounded by circumstance. The Great Depression hollowed out entire communities, and professional football was seen by many players as a chance, often their only chance, to earn a wage above the poverty line. The pay was low, but compared to factory work, it was something. For some, it was survival. For others, it was escape. That desperation created a culture where men accepted punishment no modern athlete would tolerate. Newspaper columns of the era reflected the public's fascination with the violence. Writers described players as gladiators, Iron Men, or human battering rams, and the men themselves embraced those labels. Because in a time before multi-million-dollar contracts or endorsement deals, identity was all they had to hold on to. Their legend was their currency. If they could not be paid well, they could at least be feared and remembered. The league itself was fragile in those years. Teams folded constantly. Franchises moved or disappeared overnight. Stability was rare, and with instability came exploitation. Owners paid little, promised less, and demanded everything. Players were sometimes forced to sign waivers before games, absolving management of responsibility for injuries. Imagine walking into a stadium knowing you might not walk out again, and signing a paper that told the world your pain was yours alone to bear. The violence was not confined to the physical body. There was emotional and psychological hardship as well. Men traveled on buses for hours through cold winters, sleeping on hard seats, arriving at towns where no one cared who they were. They played before sparse crowds, sometimes only a few hundred people, most of them skeptical about whether professional football deserved to exist at all. College football was king. The NFL was the poor, rowdy cousin trying to carve out space in America's imagination. And so the players became both pioneers and victims. Pioneers because they built a sport that would one day command the world's attention. Victims because their suffering was the foundation upon which that empire was raised. There are names history remembers. Red Grange, Dutch Clark. These men became folk heroes, symbols of toughness that transcended the sport. But for every Nagurski, there were dozens more who never made headlines. Linemen whose names we will never know. Men who limped home after games to tend bar, work farms, or haul steel. Men whose lives were shortened by injuries that modern medicine would treat with surgery, but which then were left to fester. Men whose families buried them in obscurity, with no pension, no insurance, no acknowledgement from the league they once served. What fascinates me, and what chills me, is how normalized this violence was. Players spoke of it casually. They accepted concussions as getting your bell rung. They played through dislocated shoulders, cracked vertebrae, shattered hands. If you could stand, you could play. If you could not stand, you were forgotten. Even the equipment reflected the indifference. Leather helmets softened impact only marginally. Shoulder pads were thin slabs of felt and leather, held together with straps that snapped under strain. There was no standardization, no oversight, no concern for safety. Each man was responsible for his own survival, and survival often meant sacrifice. This is where the story of the NFL's Darkside truly begins, not in boardrooms or television deals, but in mud, blood, and silence. It begins with men who traded their health for a paycheck that barely covered rent. Men who endured because they believed the game demanded it. Men who shaped a sport that would one day dazzle the world, though it cost them almost everything. And so we return to the central truth. Professional football was never clean. It was never safe. It was born in hardship, carried on the backs of men who had little else to give. Their stories are not footnotes. They are the foundation. And if we want to understand the violence of football today, we must first understand the violence of football then. This is the story of old-school NFL violence, a story of hardship, survival, and sacrifice. A story buried under decades of glamour but never erased. A story that asks us to reckon with what was demanded of the men who played, and what was taken from them in return. When I step back and consider the story of professional football in America, I see two timelines unfolding at once. One is familiar, the glittering arc from sandlots to Super Bowls. A game that grew from obscurity to dominance, shaping Sundays and national identity alike. The other timeline is darker. It is made of the bodies and lives of men who bore the game's weight long before the NFL was an empire. To understand football's ascent, we must confront its foundation in violence and hardship. We must tell the story not just of touchdowns and trophies, but of the hidden toll exacted from those who played in the shadows of history. The National Football League of the 1920s and 1930s was fragile, almost experimental. Teams folded constantly. Owners operated on shoestring budgets. Crowds were sparse, often smaller than the ones that gathered for local high school games. Professional football was considered a lesser version of the sport. College football reigned supreme, drawing tens of thousands to stadiums across the country. To many, the NFL was not respectable. It was gritty, unpredictable, and faintly disreputable. That reputation bled onto the men who played it. Yet, those men persisted. Why? Because football, even then, offered a small chance at something better. For farmhands, miners, and factory workers, the chance to earn a paycheck by playing a game-even one that brutalized the body was worth taking. Average salaries were meager, often no more than $100 a game, if that. But in the middle of the Great Depression, $100 could mean survival. It could mean rent paid, food on the table, or a brief reprieve from crushing poverty. Players accepted the risks because the alternative was often worse. Violence became part of the bargain. The NFL of that era was a place where brutality was expected, not exceptional. Rules were minimal and enforcement was lax. A lineman could throw a punch in the trenches with little fear of penalty. Tackles were not so much about bringing a man down as they were about driving him into the dirt until he gasped for air. Newspaper writers described the games with language that today sounds almost medieval accounts of bone-crunching clashes and iron men battling in the mud. This culture of violence was reinforced by the equipment, or rather, the lack of it. Leather helmets provided scant protection. Shoulder pads were thin and inconsistent. There was no face mask to shield the mouth or jaw, no advanced technology to absorb impact. Every collision carried risk, and every risk was accepted as part of the game. Concussions were common, but they were rarely acknowledged. Players who staggered or lost consciousness were said to have their bell rung. Trainers would wave smelling salts under their noses, and if they could stand, they returned to play. There was no medical protocol, no understanding of long-term brain trauma, only the expectation that men keep going. The hardships extended beyond the field. Travel was grueling. Teams rode buses or trains for hours, sometimes overnight, with little sleep before taking the field. Meals were cheap and inconsistent, accommodations sparse. Players were not stars. They were journeymen, often anonymous, drifting from team to team as franchises folded or relocated. Some played both offense and defense because rosters were small and substitutions limited. Injuries piled up, but with no pensions, no guaranteed contracts, and no health insurance. Playing hurt was not a choice but a necessity. Even the legends of the game, the names etched in history, endured this grind. Bronko Nagurski, one of the most celebrated players of the 1930s, worked as a professional wrestler in the off-season because football alone did not pay enough to support his family. Red Grange, the galloping ghost, whose signing with the Chicago Bears in 1925 helped legitimize the NFL, was paraded across the country in a grueling barnstorming tour that left his body battered. These were the stars. Imagine what life was like for the players, whose names never reached a headline. The media glorified the toughness of these men. Writers painted them as warriors, willing to endure any punishment for the love of the game. And in part, that was true. Many players did love the game, but love alone does not explain why men continued to sacrifice their health for so little reward. Desperation explains it. Economic necessity explains it. And the cultural ideals of masculinity at the time, stoicism, endurance, silence in the face of pain, explain it. A man who complained risked ridicule. A man who quit risked shame. The locker room did not tolerate weakness, and society celebrated those who seemed immune to suffering. Yet behind closed doors, many players lived with consequences that would haunt them long after their careers ended. Chronic pain, limited mobility, head trauma, and shortened life expectancy were common. Few players lived to old age without lingering damage. The league did not acknowledge these sacrifices. There was no system of support for former players. Once a man's usefulness on the field ended, so too did the NFL's concern for him. It is tempting to view these stories as relics of a brutal past, chapters of a game that evolved and matured over time. But when I look closely, I see echoes that continue even today. Modern football is infinitely more lucrative, better organized, and equipped with advanced technology. Yet the culture of silence around pain, the glorification of violence, and the economic pressures that push men to risk their bodies remain. The difference is scale. What was once endured in front of a few hundred spectators is now broadcast to millions. What was once dismissed as part of the game is now studied under the lens of medical science, lawsuits, and national debate. That is why telling this story matters. The NFL's old-school violence is not a footnote, is the foundation. Without those men, without their sacrifices, the league would not exist as it does today. Their hardships laid the groundwork for the spectacle we now take for granted. But we cannot celebrate the present without reckoning with the cost of the past. In this documentary, we will journey into that hidden history. We will explore the brutal conditions players faced, from the leather helmet era to the early decades when professional football teetered on the edge of collapse. We will hear the stories of men who gave everything for a game that gave them little in return. We will examine the culture of violence that defined those years, the economic forces that drove men onto the field, and the legacy of suffering that still lingers. We will not turn away from the pain. We will not soften the edges. To understand football's glory, we must understand its darkness. To honor the men who built the game, we must tell the truth about what they endured. The chapters ahead will move through this history step by step. We will begin with the early days of the league, when survival itself was uncertain. We will trace the lives of players who lived and died in obscurity. We will uncover the cultural myths that glorified their pain and the systemic indifference that left them unprotected. Each story is a thread in a larger fabric, weaving together the reality of a sport that demanded blood before it offered glory. This is not just a history of football. It is a history of sacrifice, silence, and survival. It is the untold story of the NFL's Darkside, a story that forces us to reconsider what it means to play a game and what it costs to make that game endure. The violence of football is not an accident. It is not a byproduct. It is part of its DNA, present from the beginning, shaping the men who played and the culture that surrounded them. As we move forward, we will peel back the layers of myth to reveal the raw truth beneath. And so, the journey begins. When I think about the birth of the National Football League, I do not picture grand stadiums or championship parades. I picture small towns, rented fields, and groups of men whose futures were uncertain, even as they laced up their cleats. The league that would one day dominate. American culture began in 1920 under the name of the American Professional Football Association. Its founders met in a car showroom in Canton, Ohio. Fittingly modest beginning for what seemed at the time like a fragile experiment. The men who played in those early years were not celebrities. They were mill workers, farmers, teachers, and laborers. Football was not a career. It was a side job, one step above playing for the local athletic club. Most players earned between $50 and $100 per game. Some earned less. Even the best players rarely received more than a few $100s for an entire season. For context, a factory worker might make about the same in a steady job, but the factory did not leave you with broken ribs or concussions every week. Still, football held an allure. It was a chance to escape routine labor, a chance to travel, and most of all, a chance to feel a fleeting kind of glory. For men who had grown up watching college football dominate headlines, playing professionally was a way to live out a dream, however imperfect. But the dream came at a cost. Conditions were harsh from the start. Games were played on fields that were little more than open lots, mud pooled in the corners. Rocks jutted up through the dirt. Cold winds cut across Midwestern towns in November, leaving players bruised, not just from contact, but from the elements themselves. There were no dome stadiums, no heated sidelines, and no protective gear worth mentioning. The leather helmets, if a player could afford one, softened impact only slightly. Uniforms were heavy canvas, easily torn and quickly soaked through by rain. A man could play for quarters and come off the field shivering, with bloodied hands and torn skin, and there was nothing waiting for him but a cold locker room or the back of a bus headed home. In those days, rosters were small. Substitutions were limited. That meant players were expected to go both ways, offense and defense, for the entire game. Imagine playing 60 minutes of violent, unrelenting collisions with no break, no chance to rest. A man could dislocate a shoulder on one drive and be expected to tackle with it on the next. The measure of a player was not skill alone. It was endurance, toughness, and silence in the face of pain. There are stories from this era that sound almost unbelievable to modern ears. A player would have his nose broken in the first quarter, stuffed cotton inside to stop the bleeding and finish the game. Another might crack a rib, but be wrapped in tape and sent back out, because without him, the team could not field enough men. There was no medical staff beyond perhaps a trainer with a bucket of water and smelling salts. Injuries that today would require surgery were left untreated. And yet, the games continued. The owners of these early franchises treated players as replaceable. If a man was too injured to play, he was released and replaced with another willing body. Contracts offered no security, and there were no unions to bargain for better conditions. Football was a business for owners, but survival for players. The owners gambled on ticket sales. The players gambled with their health. One of the most striking examples of the era's brutality came in 1921, when Fritz Pollard, one of the first black players and coaches in the league, described the treatment he endured. Pollard not only faced physical punishment on the field, opponents targeted him mercilessly, but also bore the weight of racism in every stadium. He recalled being spit on, elbowed in the face, and intentionally stepped on, not just as part of the game, but as a message. Yet Pollard kept playing, kept coaching, because he knew that walking away meant surrendering both opportunity and dignity. His resilience became symbolic of what every player endured in his own way. Hardship met with defiance. Even the celebrated figures bore scars. Jim Thorpe, often remembered as the league's first great star, joined the Canton Bulldogs and helped give credibility to the fledgling NFL. But Thorpe's life was marked by constant struggle. He was paid poorly, shuffled between teams, and forced to rely on his reputation to draw crowds. By the time the league stabilized, Thorpe's career was fading. He ended his life in poverty, working odd jobs far removed from the fields where he once dazzled crowds. His story was not an exception, which was the rule. The 1920s and 1930s also introduced a culture of intimidation that was baked into the game. Coaches demanded that players hit harder, fight longer, and never show weakness. Stories circulated of practices where players were ordered to collide full speed until one of them could no longer stand. Pain was not just expected, it was required. Those who could endure it earned respect. Those who could not disappeared quietly. As the Great Depression deepened in the 1930s, these hardships became even more pronounced. Jobs were scarce, and football became a desperate means of survival for many. Teams often folded mid-season, leaving players stranded without pay. Some men traveled hundreds of miles to join a team, only to find themselves unemployed weeks later. There were no guarantees. There was only the next game, the next paycheck, the next collision. Consider the story of linemen in those days. They were anonymous, rarely written about, yet they bore the brunt of the violence. They smashed into each other on every play, their bodies absorbing punishment that accumulated silently over time. Decades later, some of these men would struggle to walk, their joints ravaged, their backs bent. Few lived long enough to see the league prosper. Their sacrifices paved the way, but their names vanished. The violence of those early years shaped the identity of professional football. Fans who attended games did not come for finesse. They came for collisions. They wanted to see toughness. They wanted to see men endure what ordinary people could not. And so the game became a spectacle of survival as much as sport. The players knew it, the owners knew it, and the audience demanded it. When I look back at these beginnings, I see a paradox. The NFL's survival depended on the willingness of men to destroy themselves for little reward. Without that willingness, the league might never have survived the lean years of its infancy. But that very sacrifice ensured that countless players lived and died in obscurity, their bodies broken long before their time. This is the dark foundation upon which professional football was built, a game sustained by violence, hardship, and the desperation of men who could not afford to quit. Their suffering created the sport we know today, but their names are etched only faintly, if at all, in the public memory. As we move forward, we will see how this culture of violence hardened. how it became institutionalized, and how the players of the early NFL endured hardships that would set the tone for decades to come. Their stories are not distant relics. They are the opening chapter of a game that still wrestles with the legacy of its violent birth. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the country slid into a darkness unlike anything it had known before. By the early 1930s, bread lines stretched across city blocks. Factories closed their gates, and millions of families lived with the constant fear of hunger. Against this backdrop, the National Football League tried to survive. For the players, survival took on a harsher meaning. Football was no longer just a game. It was a lifeline. And the violence of the sport deepened as desperation grew. Professional football in the Depression era was a mirror of the nation itself, battered, unstable, and yet stubbornly clinging to existence. Teams came and went with dizzying speed. Rosters shifted constantly. The pay, already meager in the 1920s, shrank further. Many players received only $50 a game, sometimes less. Some were paid under the table. Others were paid late, or not at all, if a team's attendance dropped too low. Players understood the reality. If fans didn't show, their paycheck disappeared. And yet, they played. They played because even a small wage meant survival. For some men, a single game could put food on the table for a week. For others, it meant avoiding the humiliation of the unemployment line. Football became not just a sport, but a desperate wager in a time when opportunities were scarce. This desperation bred a new level of violence. Players took risks they might not have taken otherwise. A broken arm could end a season and a paycheck, but many played through it because missing a game meant losing money their families could not spare. Concussions were shrugged off with stoicism because silence was cheaper than medical care. Men endured injuries in ways that defied belief. They wrapped torn muscles with rags, bound ribs with tape, and injected painkillers that dulled agony for only a few quarters. Weakness was not an option. In the Depression, weakness could mean hunger. The league itself embraced this image of toughness. Owners marketed the brutality of the game as part of its appeal. Newspaper stories highlighted collisions with words like bone-crushing and savage. Fans, themselves worn down by hardship, came to the stadiums to see men endure punishment worse than their own daily struggles. For a few hours, they could cheer resilience, as if watching football's violence was a symbolic victory over the Depression itself. But the reality for the players was far less glorious. Travel conditions were harsh. Teams rode buses across rough roads for hours, often sleeping in their uniforms to save time and money. Meals were cheap, sometimes just bread and soup, provided by local sponsors or scraped together from what players could afford. Lodging was often in low-cost boarding houses where players crammed into shared rooms. These men were not pampered athletes, they were working-class survivors moving from one contest of endurance to the next. One story often told from this era is that of Bronco Nagurski. Nagurski was the Chicago Bears' legendary fullback, a man whose name came to symbolize toughness. He was said to run with such force that defenders bounced off him like kindling. But what made Nagurski extraordinary was not just his size or power, was the fact that he kept playing through injuries that would have sidelined most men. In one game, Nagurski reportedly played with cracked vertebrae, wrapped tightly enough to move without collapsing. Because the team needed him, and he could not afford to miss the paycheck. Nagurski's story was celebrated in the press as evidence of his greatness. What was rarely mentioned was the underlying truth. He had little choice. Professional football in the 1930s paid so poorly that Nagurski wrestled professionally in the off-season to support his family. Even the era's biggest star could not rely on football alone. That reality was magnified for the hundreds of nameless players who lacked Nagurski's fame. For them, every game was survival. Every hit a gamble against hunger and obscurity. The Depression also revealed the instability of the league itself. Teams folded mid-season, leaving players stranded. The Minneapolis Red Jackets, the Providence Steamroller, the Portsmouth Spartans. These names flickered in and out of existence, leaving behind rosters of men suddenly without income. Some players moved from team to team, chasing contracts that might last only weeks. Others left the game altogether, returning to labor in factories or fields, their brief careers forgotten. Violence was compounded by the culture of scarcity. Coaches demanded more from fewer men. Rosters were small, so players often lined up for every down offense, defense, and special teams. A lineman might play 60 bruising minutes in the mud, then punt the ball or run downfield on coverage. Injuries were inevitable, but replacements were rare. If you could walk, you played. If you could not, another desperate man waited for your spot. The Depression-era NFL was also marked by a rugged kind of lawlessness on the field. Officials existed, but enforcement was inconsistent. Fights broke out regularly. Players punched, gouged, and clawed in piles without consequence. The lack of face masks meant fists connected with jaws, elbows cracked against teeth, and eyes were gouged in the scramble for the ball. Officiating crews often turned a blind eye. The violence kept fans entertained, and entertainment was survival for the league. Yet beneath the brutality, there was camaraderie among players. They shared meals, shared rides, and shared the unspoken bond of men enduring the same punishment for the same thin reward. They joked about broken bones as if to mask the fear. They taped each other up, sewed each other's cuts, and passed hats in locker rooms to help a teammate buy food when wages were late. The hardships that divided them from the rest of society also bound them together. There were moments, too, when the violence went too far. Players collapsed on fields, concussed beyond recognition. Bones broke in plain sight, leaving men carried off by teammates because medical help was scarce. The crowd might gasp, but the game always continued. The NFL could not afford to pause. Survival depended on pushing forward, no matter the cost. For the men themselves, the consequences lingered long after the cheers faded. Many Depression-era players left the game with chronic pain, bad backs, and joints that never healed. They returned to ordinary jobs unable to perform them fully, yet with no pension or insurance to fall back on. Their sacrifice was not rewarded with fame or fortune. It was rewarded with obscurity and hardship. This was the NFL of the 1930s, a league hanging by a thread, kept alive by the willingness of men to endure suffering for survival. Their violence was not just part of the sport, was the cost of staying alive in a world where every dollar mattered. Looking back, I see the Depression as a crucible. It tested not only the country, but the league itself. The NFL survived those years because its players endured what no one else would. But that endurance left scars on bodies, scars on lives, scars on a sport that built its identity on violence, because violence was all it had to sell. The next chapter of this story will take us into the era when the NFL began to stabilize, when the league slowly grew into national consciousness, and when the hardships of players shifted but never disappeared. As the league's profile rose, so too did the demands on those who played. And the violence that once defined survival began to define spectacle. By the late 1930s, the National Football League was no longer fighting merely for its existence. It was beginning, slowly, to stake a claim in the American consciousness. But survival was not the same as stability. The league was still fragile, still small. Still overshadowed by college football, which dominated headlines and filled stadiums with pageantry that the NFL could not yet replicate. What professional football offered, instead, was something raw. Violence wrapped in desperation, spectacle born from necessity. The men who played the game in this era lived at the intersection of hope and hardship. And even as the NFL began to find its footing, the physical toll on its players only deepened. The 1930s closed with the Green Bay Packers, the Chicago Bears, and the New York Giants carving out reputations as powerhouses. These franchises began to define professional football's identity. But even in the league's most successful cities, crowds were modest. Games drew thousands, not tens of thousands. Newspapers gave them space, but always behind the grand stories of college rivalries like Army-Navy or Notre Dame-USC. Pro football still carried a stigma, was viewed as rough trade, a mercenary's pursuit rather than a gentleman's game. Yet for the players, mercenary was precisely the word. They were hired hands, disposable if injured, replaceable if they faltered. Their contracts were thin, their paychecks inconsistent. Many were still earning no more than $100 a game. That money mattered, especially as the Depression lingered and then gave way to the uncertainties of the coming war years. But it was never enough to justify the punishment they endured. The game itself was evolving. Coaches like George Halas of the Bears introduced formations and strategies that demanded more from players than ever before. Halas's teams became known for precision and ferocity, blending brute force with tactical innovation. His T-formation offense revolutionized football, setting the stage for the modern passing game. But innovation came at a price. The speed of the game increased, and with it, the collisions grew even more dangerous. Protective equipment, though improving, remained rudimentary. Leather helmets grew slightly sturdier, but they still offered little real protection. Shoulder pads were thin, stitched together with canvas and padding that compressed under impact. Jerseys were wool, heavy and waterlogged in rain, clinging to bodies and dragging them down. On cold November afternoons, fields turned into frozen battlefields. Players slammed into one another on turf as hard as concrete. Bodies bruising, bones fracturing, heads snapping back in collisions that left them dazed and staggering. The violence was celebrated in print. Sports writers painted collisions as gladiatorial clashes. Fans loved the spectacle of it. But the toll was private. Players bore injuries quietly. There were no medical staffs, no independent trainers. A man shaken unconscious was roused with smelling salts, patted on the back, and told to get back in. A fractured rib was wrapped, hidden beneath the uniform, ignored until the season ended. In that silence, the league grew, profiting from the sacrifices of its laborers. As the 1940s dawned, another force reshaped the NFL: war. When the United States entered World War II, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the league faced a crisis. Many of its players enlisted or were drafted, leaving rosters depleted. Teams scrambled to fill lineups with older men, college leftovers, and anyone willing to put on a uniform. The quality of play suffered, but the league pressed forward. The wartime years were strange ones for football. Teams merged just to survive. The Pittsburgh Steelers combined with the Philadelphia Eagles to form the Steagles. For a season, the Chicago Cardinals joined with the Steelers to create the Card Pit team, mocked by fans as carpets for the way opponents walked over them. These makeshift rosters reflected the chaos of the times. Yet the NFL endured, refusing to shutter its doors even as the world burned. For players, the war years meant double burdens. Those who remained stateside played for meager wages, often while holding down other jobs. Some worked in factories or shipyards during the week, then suited up on Sunday. Football was no longer just violent, it was exhausting. The sport became a test of endurance, of balancing survival and daily life with the survival demanded on the field. But the war also shifted the league's image. Soldiers overseas listened to broadcasts of games, and football became tied to patriotism, to the spirit of endurance and resilience. When the war ended, the NFL returned to a country eager for distraction and spectacle. And with that return came a slow but undeniable transformation. By the late 1940s, the NFL began to see its first glimpses of real stardom. Players like Sammy Baugh redefined positions his passing electrified fans, proving that professional football could be more than brawling in the trenches. Crowds grew. Television, still in its infancy, carried highlights into living rooms. For the first time, pro football was visible in ways it had never been before. Yet the brutality remained. Behind the rising profile of the sport, the conditions of players lagged. Paychecks increased slightly, but they did not reflect the league's growing revenues. Players still lacked insurance, still bore the full cost of injury. Their careers remained short, their futures uncertain. The glamour belonged to the league, not the men who gave their bodies to it. I think of those years as a paradox. On the surface, football was rising. The league was gaining attention, clawing its way toward the American mainstream. But beneath that progress, the old patterns remained. Players were expendable. Injuries were invisible. Pain was part of the job description. The violence that defined the Depression years did not vanish with the end of hardship. It simply became institutionalized, woven into the fabric of the sport as the price of growth. There are stories from this period that haunt me. Tales of players who gave everything, only to be forgotten. One lineman, unnamed in the papers, left the field with his nose shattered and teeth knocked out, only to return the next week. Another suffered a broken leg that never healed properly. He limped for the rest of his life, his career over after a few seasons. These stories did not make headlines. They were the hidden cost of the league's ascent. And yet, in spite of all this, players kept coming. The dream of playing professionally, even for small money, even for brutal punishment, was enough to draw them in. Because football offered something else, something intangible: pride. For a young man in the 1940s, wearing an NFL uniform meant defying obscurity, proving toughness, and claiming a sliver of immortality in a world where few opportunities existed. The league grew because these men endured. They carried it on their backs through broken bones and concussed nights, through war years and lean wages. Their violence became the foundation upon which the NFL would later build its empire. By the close of the 1940s, the NFL was poised for a breakthrough. The 1958 championship game, often called the greatest game ever played, was still a decade away. But the seeds were planted. Television would bring the sport to millions. Stars would emerge. Owners would grow rich. But none of that would have been possible without the forgotten generation of the 1930s and 1940s men who endured the game at its rawest, who turned survival into spectacle, who laid down their bodies so that professional football could rise. As the story moves forward, we enter the 1950s and 1960s. Decades when the NFL's identity hardened, when television transformed the league, and when violence became not just survival, but entertainment. The brutality would not fade. It would be magnified, packaged, and sold to a nation hungry for heroes and collisions. The 1950s were a turning point for professional football. The league had survived the Depression. It had endured the war years. It had even begun to carve out a modest presence in America's sports culture. But what came next would alter not just the fortunes of the NFL, but the very way Americans consumed the game. For the first time, football became a product designed not only for the people in the stadium, but for the millions beyond it. This was the decade when television entered the picture and violence, once a burden borne in silence, became part of the league's selling point. Television was still in its infancy when it discovered football. In the early 1950s, only a fraction of American households owned a set. But those flickering black and white screens created a new kind of stage. Baseball had been the national pastime, the sport of record books and lazy summer afternoons. Boxing filled arenas with its brutality and drew millions to radios. College football still owned prestige. The NFL was somewhere in between, not yet dominant, but growing hungrier by the season. The league recognized the potential of television quickly. Broadcasts could reach audiences who had never set foot inside a stadium. They could make stars out of players, household names from otherwise anonymous men. And in those broadcasts, one element of the game stood out: the sheer physical collision of bodies. On television, violence did not look crude, looked thrilling, became a spectacle that cameras sought and fans expected. The Chicago Bears under George Halas had already popularized hard-hitting football. Their clashes with the Green Bay Packers and New York Giants were legendary in toughness. But now, those clashes could be replayed in living rooms, narrated by announcers who heightened the drama. A broken tackle, a crushing hit, these were no longer just stories told the next day in bars. They were moments replayed for millions, burned into memory. The brutality that once alienated polite society became part of football's allure. One of the league's first television stars was Sam Huff, a linebacker for the New York Giants. In 1960, CBS aired a documentary titled The Violent World of Sam Huff. It depicted him as both warrior and victim, embodying the duality of professional football. Huff himself described the experience of being inside the pileups, the bone-jarring hits, the dizzying aftermath of collisions. When you hit a man hard enough, Huff said, you can feel his body shudder. His words were raw, unsettling, and magnetic. Millions watched, and football's reputation as America's most violent game solidified. But before Huff's star turn, the 1950s had already planted the seeds. Stars like Otto Graham, quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, dominated headlines. The Browns under Paul Brown were methodical, almost militaristic in their approach. Paul Brown introduced innovations, playbooks, film study, and strict discipline that professionalized the game in ways no coach had before. Yet for all the strategy, the foundation was still violence. The Browns won with precision, but they also won with relentless physicality. What television revealed was not just the hits, but the hardship. Fans saw players limping off the field, bloody, battered, and yet returning to play. They saw broken noses under leather helmets, jerseys torn, mud streaked across faces. The image of the football player became a symbol of toughness, of stoicism, of sacrifice. And in post-war America, where masculinity was defined by resilience and endurance, those images resonated deeply. The NFL capitalized on this cultural shift. League officials began to understand that the violence of the game was not something to hide, was something to market. Promotions highlighted the collisions. Films produced by NFL Films, founded by Ed Sabal in 1962, but inspired by trends beginning in the 50s, would later glorify slow-motion hits, helmets colliding, bodies crashing to the turf. The seeds of that aesthetic were planted in this decade. Yet for players, little changed. The spectacle enriched the league, not the men on the field. Contracts remained small by today's standards. Even stars like Otto Graham earned salaries that paled in comparison to baseball's best. For rank-and-file players, wages were still modest and careers were short. A man might play 5 years, 10 if lucky, and then face the rest of his life with a broken body and little financial security. Medical care lagged behind. A player concussed on Sunday was expected back the next week. Broken fingers were taped. Torn ligaments were barely understood. Careers ended suddenly and often brutally. Some players disappeared into obscurity after injuries, their names forgotten as the league celebrated new heroes. The contradiction grew sharper with each passing year. Football's violence was profitable, but it was also devastating. The league promoted the spectacle, while the individuals behind it paid the price. This duality violence, as both entertainment and exploitation, became the defining tension of the sport's rise. Consider the 1958 NFL championship game, often called the greatest game ever played. The Baltimore Colts defeated the New York Giants in sudden death. Overtime, a thrilling contest broadcast nationally. Millions watched, and the game cemented football's place in American culture. But behind the excitement were bodies battered beyond recognition. Players staggered off the field after 4 quarters and overtime of punishing collisions. For the league, it was triumph. For the players, it was survival. That single game demonstrated television's power. The NFL had found its stage, its platform, and its audience. And the centerpiece of that show was not only the athleticism or strategy, it was the spectacle of violence. Now framed as heroic. Football became America's new drama, a theater of toughness where men endured unimaginable pain for fleeting glory. In reflecting on that era, I see the irony clearly. Television saved the NFL. It gave the league visibility, credibility, and momentum. But it also magnified the very hardships that players had been quietly enduring since the 1920s. It turned pain into entertainment. It made collisions into highlights. And in doing so, it set the template for decades to come. The 1950s closed with football on the rise. The 1960s would bring expansion, television contracts, and the eventual merger with the AFL. But the foundation was built here, in the decade when violence became not just part of the game, but the product itself. The hardships of the players, once hidden, were now displayed for all to see, but not in a way that inspired reform. Instead, they became part of the mythology, part of what made football irresistible to the American public. This was the paradox that defined the NFL's ascent. The more it grew, the more it demanded from its players. The league's success was measured not in how it protected them, but in how well it packaged their suffering into something fans could cheer for. As we turn to the 1960s, the story becomes even more complex. Expansion brought new opportunities, but also new pressures. Television grew, contracts expanded, and stars began to emerge as national icons. Yet with that growth came greater collisions, greater demands, and greater costs. The violence that once seemed raw and hidden was now celebrated, replayed, and enshrined as part of America's identity. The 1960s were a decade of collision. Collision on the field, where men threw their bodies with reckless abandon in pursuit of victory. Collision off the field, where two leagues, the NFL and the upstart American Football League, fought for survival, attention, and dominance. Collision in culture itself, as America convulsed with change, from civil rights marches to the specter of Vietnam. Professional football did not exist apart from these forces. It absorbed them, reflected them, and in many ways amplified them. Violence became both the language of the sport and the currency of its competition. The decade began with the NFL as the established power. It was older, more conservative, and proud of its traditions. But the AFL burst onto the scene in 1960, brash, innovative, and willing to take risks. The AFL challenged the NFL on every front, signing college stars, experimenting with wide-open offenses, and embracing television in ways the older league had resisted. Suddenly, professional football was no longer one story, it was two, and both were built on the backs of men willing to endure punishment most of us cannot imagine. The competition between leagues drove salaries up, but it also drove the violence higher. Teams sought the toughest players, the hardest hitters, the men who could break opponents' wills as well as their bones. This was not an era of load management or concussion protocol. It was an era when players taped their ankles, strapped on thin helmets, and went back out, no matter how battered they were. The rivalry between leagues made every game a proving ground, every collision a statement of legitimacy. Consider the Oakland Raiders, one of the AFL's most infamous teams. Under Al Davis, the Raiders cultivated an image of ferocity. Their brand was intimidation. They saw players who relished the violence of the game, men who hit harder, played dirtier, and showed less mercy. For fans, this was thrilling. For opponents, it was terrifying. The Raiders embodied the AFL's willingness to embrace chaos and aggression as entertainment. Meanwhile, the NFL doubled down on its own identity. Teams like the Green Bay Packers under Vince Lombardi represented discipline, precision, and toughness honed through structure. Lombardi's Packers won championships through relentless preparation and brutal physicality. Practices were demanding, games even more so. His players, many of whom worked through staggering injuries, carried themselves like soldiers in a campaign. Lombardi preached sacrifice. And sacrifice in the NFL of the 1960s meant playing through pain so intense it left men scarred for life. The collisions were not just physical, but cultural. The AFL embraced diversity earlier than the NFL, giving more opportunities to black players and placing them in leadership roles on the field. The NFL, slower to change, was forced to follow as the AFL signed stars who electrified audiences. That integration made the game faster, more athletic, and yes, more violent. The speed of play increased, the hits grew more jarring, and the injuries more severe. Television amplified it all. By the mid-1960s, pro football was no longer a niche. It was becoming America's favorite sport to watch, surpassing even baseball in excitement for younger audiences. CBS and NBC aired games weekly. Highlights reached millions. For the first time, slow-motion replays allowed viewers to see the moment of impact, the helmet striking ribs, the shoulder crashing into a jaw, the body twisting unnaturally to the ground. Violence was no longer hidden in the blur of action. It was captured, replayed, and glorified. Players paid the price. Concussions were rampant. They were called getting your bell rung, or seeing stars, and they were shrugged off as part of the game. Broken bones healed poorly, and men returned before they were ready. Painkillers were used liberally, not as a cure, but as a mask to keep players on the field. The careers were still short, the futures still uncertain. But the league needed the show to go on, and the players, bound by pride and financial need, complied. The climax of this violent decade was the 1968 season and the Super Bowl that followed. When the New York Jets of the AFL, led by Joe Namath, defeated the Baltimore Colts of the NFL in Super Bowl III, the balance of power shifted. Namath's guarantee of victory, followed by his team's triumph, forced the NFL to take the AFL seriously. That victory was not just a football game. It was a collision of leagues, cultures, and eras. It proved the AFL's legitimacy and paved the way for the merger that would transform professional football into the empire it became. But beneath the celebration, the hardships endured by the players remained the constant. The 1960s ended with men broken, careers shortened, lives altered. The league had grown richer, television audiences larger, the spectacle more enthralling. Yet the laborers of that spectacle were still disposable. Their bodies were the cost of progress. Their pain was the invisible scaffolding holding up the sport's new empire. Looking back on the 1960s, I see it as a decade of escalation. Every hit was harder, every game more consequential, every injury more costly. The rivalry between the NFL and AFL accelerated the violence of the sport. Television magnified it. Fans consumed it. Owners profited from it. And the players bore it, silently, stoically, often until their bodies failed them. The merger of the two leagues, finalized in 1970, would bring stability. It would also bring new levels of visibility and wealth. But it would not ease the hardships. If anything, it would magnify them. Because with greater stakes came greater pressure. With more eyes watching came higher expectations for spectacle. And with the game now firmly entrenched as America's sport, the violence that had once been survival became ritual, demanded week after week, year after year. The 1960s were not simply a chapter in football's history. They were the crucible in which modern football was forged violent, profitable, and relentless. The game had become more than sport. It had become a national drama, a weekly test of endurance that thrilled millions, even as it destroyed the men who played it. As we move into the 1970s, the league enters a new phase: consolidation, expansion, and the era of dynasties. The merger brings unity. Television deals bring unprecedented money, and stars begin to rise to cultural icon status. But the violence, the hardships, the unseen costs, they do not diminish. They grow sharper, more visible, and more destructive. The 1970s marked a turning point in American football. By then, the NFL had completed its long courtship with the AFL. And the merger gave the sport not just new teams, but new legitimacy. What had once been dismissed as a niche pastime for working-class men was now becoming America's most watched game. Television networks competed for broadcast rights. Advertisers poured millions into sponsorships. And football on Sunday was no longer a diversion, but a ritual. But beneath the polished veneer of halftime shows, sleek logos, and carefully marketed stars, the old violence remained, sharper than ever. In fact, in many ways, it was institutionalized. I think about the men who came into the league during that decade. They were heirs to the brutality of the leather helmet era, but they were also pioneers in a new age of spectacle. The money was better than it had ever been, but the risks were still the same, and often worse. The difference was that the spotlight was brighter, and the violence was now choreographed for mass consumption. The NFL was no longer a backroom attraction. It was the front-page show, and with that came both glory and tragedy. The 1970s were defined by dynasties, by teams that carved their names into the mythology of the sport. The Pittsburgh Steelers, with their steel curtain defense, embodied the decade's brutality. They weren't just good, they were terrifying. Joe Green, Jack Lambert, and L.C. Greenwood didn't merely stop offenses, they demolished them. When opponents lined up against Pittsburgh, they weren't just preparing for a game. They were bracing for survival. It was football as collision theater, and the audience couldn't look away. And then there were the Oakland Raiders, a team that seemed to embrace chaos as a philosophy. Al Davis, their owner and architect, celebrated rebellion and violence as part of the Raiders' identity. They were outlaws in black and silver, and they carried that reputation proudly. Players like Jack Tatum, nicknamed the Assassin, embodied the edge of the game. Tatum once wrote that he didn't hit to knock opponents down. He hit to knock them out. His most infamous moment came in 1978, when his collision with Darryl Stingley left the New England wide receiver paralyzed from the neck down. It was a moment that shook the league, but also revealed its contradictions. On one hand, there was horror at the devastation. On the other, there was a grim acknowledgement that this was the game the public had come to love hard, punishing and unforgiving. I can't separate the decade's triumphs from its tragedies. The Super Bowls, the expanding television contracts, the rise of household names like Terry Bradshaw, Roger Staubach, and Walter Patton, all of it existed alongside a mounting toll of shattered knees, concussions, and shortened careers. The helmets were more advanced than in the 1950s, but the collisions were faster and more violent, the athletes stronger and heavier. Medical understanding lagged far behind. Concussions were still treated as dings, torn ligaments, were part of the job. There was no such thing as player safety as we understand it today. The paradox of the 1970s NFL is that while the league marketed itself as a modern entertainment product, its foundation was still built on the same brutality that had defined it from the beginning. And the men who played the game were trapped between those two realities. They were celebrities with endorsements and fans, but they were also disposable. Careers ended overnight, with little more than a handshake and a reminder that another player was ready to take their place. The violence wasn't just tolerated, was glorified. NFL Films, the league's cinematic arm, packaged the brutality into highlight reels that became iconic. Slow-motion shots of crunching tackles, helmets colliding, bodies spinning through the air, all set against orchestral music and the booming narration of John Facenda. It was war poetry for the masses, and it worked. Those films didn't just show the violence, they made it beautiful. They turned it into mythology. Millions of fans fell in love with the game through those reels. But what they were really falling in love with was the spectacle of men destroying themselves for victory. I remember listening to Jack Lambert years later. He was a Hall of Famer, one of the fiercest defenders the league had ever seen. But he spoke about how his teeth were knocked out, how his body was battered week after week, and how he embraced it because that was the only way to play the game. If I could start over, he once said, I'd do it all again. There's a haunting quality in that kind of loyalty. A recognition that for many players, the love of the game was inseparable from the punishment it demanded. But for every Lambert who found pride in the pain, There were men who faded into anonymity, carrying the scars long after the cheers had stopped. Darryl Stingley never walked again after that hit from Tatum. Other players slipped into lives defined by chronic pain, broken marriages, and financial struggles. The league they helped build into an empire had no safety net for them once they were gone. In that sense, the 1970s were a decade of both ascension and abandonment, the NFL rising higher than ever, while the men who played it were often left behind in the shadows. It's important to understand that this wasn't just about individual players. It was about the culture of America at the time. The 1970s were a turbulent decade. Vietnam, Watergate, economic instability. Football became a kind of national escape, a place where aggression could be contained, stylized, and broadcast into living rooms every Sunday. The league understood this, and it leaned into the violence, selling toughness as part of the national character. To watch the Steelers, the Raiders, the Cowboys, it was to watch a reflection of America's own conflicted identity, torn between discipline and rebellion, order and chaos. Looking back now, I see the 1970s as the decade when the NFL fully embraced its double life. On the surface, it was clean, marketable, and patriotic. Beneath that surface, it was still the same brutal game that had been born on muddy fields decades earlier. The helmets were shinier, the uniforms brighter, but the hardships remained. Players were still commodities. Their bodies were still sacrificed for entertainment. And the violence was not an accident of the sport, it was its heartbeat. The merger gave the NFL its empire. The dynasties gave it its mythology. And the players gave it their bodies, their health, and sometimes their futures. That is the real story of the 1970s. The rise of America's game built on the silent suffering of the men who made it possible. And yet, the decade ended with no sign of retreat. The fans wanted more. The networks wanted more. The league wanted more. Violence was not just tolerated, was demanded. The machine was in motion, and there was no stopping it. The 1980s were a decade of spectacle. If the 1970s had forged the NFL into a national institution, the 1980s turned it into America's obsession. The sport became louder, flashier, and more commercial than ever before. From neon uniforms to booming halftime shows, the NFL was no longer content to be just a game. It wanted to be culture itself. Yet beneath the glitter of endorsements and television contracts, the violence remained. In fact, as the league expanded its reach, the brutality only deepened. What struck me most about the 1980s wasn't just the rise of stars like Joe Montana, Lawrence Taylor, or Walter Patton. It was the way the league wrapped violence in glamour. A sack by Taylor wasn't just a tackle, it was a highlight played endlessly on Monday Night Football. Montana's calm brilliance, orchestrating comebacks under the harshest blitzes, made him an icon. And Peyton, known as Sweetness, ran with such elegance that fans often forgot the punishment he absorbed every Sunday. The heroes of this era were celebrated not in spite of the hardships, but because they endured them with style. Television transformed football into theater. The arrival of cable networks, especially ESPN in 1979, changed everything. Suddenly, fans didn't just see their team once a week, they saw highlights every night. Every bone-rattling hit, every moment of chaos was replayed in slow motion. Violence was now part of the brand. Fans could marvel at the artistry of Montana's passes, then gasp at the devastation of a Taylor sack, all in the same highlight reel. It was the perfect product for a decade obsessed with drama and excess. But the brutality had consequences. Consider Joe Theismann, quarterback for Washington. In 1985, during a Monday Night Football game, his career ended instantly when Lawrence Taylor sacked him. Theismann's leg snapped gruesomely on national television. The sound, the sight, the horror, it was unforgettable. Millions of viewers saw in that moment what the NFL often tried to mask. That beneath the spectacle. football was still a dangerous game that could end lives and careers in an instant. And yet, the league moved forward. Theismann's injury became a part of highlight history, remembered as much for its shock value as for its tragedy. This was the paradox of the 1980s NFL. The violence wasn't hidden. It was packaged, sold, and replayed, a reminder that suffering had become part of the entertainment. I think often about the players who lived in the shadows of the stars. Men whose names never reached national headlines, but who carried the bruises just the same. For every Montana or Taylor, there were dozens of linemen whose knees were wrecked before age 30, whose hands became twisted from years of trench warfare. Their sacrifices built the empire, but their stories rarely left the locker room. The 1980s also saw the rise of the hit men, defensive players who built reputations on intimidation. Ronnie Lott, the legendary San Francisco 49ers safety, is remembered not just for his interceptions, but for the way he punished receivers who dared to cross the middle of the field. Lott once famously amputated part of his finger rather than miss playing time. That kind of sacrifice was celebrated as toughness, as proof of dedication. But in reality, it was another reminder of how deeply the culture demanded that players surrender their bodies for the game. The league itself benefited from this culture of glorified pain. NFL films continued to craft mythology from blood and sweat. Facenda's voice still echoed, though his death in 1984 marked the end of an era. The torch was passed to the networks, who used modern production to amplify the spectacle. Halftime shows grew more elaborate, Super Bowl commercials became cultural events, and the NFL became a stage not just for athletes, but for America itself. Still, the hardships lingered behind the curtain. Concussions remained misunderstood and untreated. Players were often injected with painkillers to stay on the field. Surgeries were common. Rehabilitation rushed. The mantra was simple. The team needed you, and you played, no matter the cost. Doctors were part of the machine, patching men up just enough to send them back into battle. For players, saying no wasn't an option. Careers were short. Competition was fierce, and the unspoken rule was clear. Endure or be replaced. The decade also brought labor disputes that revealed just how fragile the players' power was. In 1987, a player strike led to 3 weeks of games played with replacements, scabs, as they were called. Owners held firm, showing that even when athletes demanded better treatment and fairer wages, the machine could keep rolling without them. Fans kept watching. Television kept broadcasting. The message was unmistakable. No individual player was bigger than the league. That realization carried a deep weight, because it meant that no matter how much glory a star achieved, his body was still expendable in the larger system. And yet, the spectacle was irresistible. The Super Bowl became the most watched event in America, a cultural holiday. Players became household names, their faces on cereal boxes, their stories woven into national lore. The NFL had conquered television, but it had also hardened its culture. To be a player in the 1980s was to live with contradiction. Celebrated as a hero, but treated as a tool. Worshipped on Sundays, but forgotten when the body gave out. When I reflect on the 1980s, I see it as the decade when the NFL perfected its double life. It was the golden age of marketing, when football became a brand as powerful as Coca-Cola or McDonald's. But the price of that branding was blood. Every commercial break, every halftime performance, every highlight reel was built on the foundation of sacrifice. The public saw heroes. The players felt the pain. Lawrence Taylor once admitted that his ferocity on the field was fueled by chaos off it. His lifestyle was reckless, his body constantly in jeopardy, but his legend grew because of it. That duality, glory and destruction intertwined, wasn't unique to him. It was the story of the decade itself. The 1980s didn't soften football. They didn't tame its violence. They dressed it up, lit it under brighter spotlights, and sold it to millions. But for the men inside the game, the hardships never left. They just became easier for the public to ignore, hidden beneath the glitter of America's favorite show. The decade ended with the NFL on top of the sporting world. The Super Bowl was a national holiday. The stars were icons. The league was rich beyond imagination. But the cost, the broken bodies, the shattered lives was still there, unpaid, and it would haunt the decades to come. The 1980s were a decade of spectacle. If the 1970s had forged the NFL into a national institution, the 1980s turned it into America's obsession. The sport became louder, flashier, and more commercial than ever before. From neon uniforms to booming halftime shows, the NFL was no longer content to be just a game. It wanted to be culture itself. Yet beneath the glitter of endorsements and television contracts, the violence remained. In fact, as the league expanded its reach, the brutality only deepened. What struck me most about the 1980s wasn't just the rise of stars like Joe Montana, Lawrence Taylor, or Walter Patton. It was the way the league wrapped violence in glamour. A sack by Taylor wasn't just a tackle, it was a highlight played endlessly on Monday Night Football. Montana's calm brilliance, orchestrating comebacks under the harshest blitzes, made him an icon. And Peyton, known as Sweetness, ran with such elegance that fans often forgot the punishment he absorbed every Sunday. The heroes of this era were celebrated not in spite of the hardships, but because they endured them with style. Television transformed football into theater. The arrival of cable networks, especially ESPN in 1979, changed everything. Suddenly, fans didn't just see their team once a week. They saw highlights every night. Every bone-rattling hit, every moment of chaos was replayed in slow motion. Violence was now part of the brand. Fans could marvel at the artistry of Montana's passes, then gasp at the devastation of a Taylor sack, all in the same highlight reel. It was the perfect product for a decade obsessed with drama and excess. But the brutality had consequences. Consider Joe Theismann, quarterback for Washington. In 1985, during a Monday Night Football game, his career ended instantly when Lawrence Taylor sacked him. Theismann's leg snapped gruesomely on national television. The sound, the sight, the horror, it was unforgettable. Millions of viewers saw in that moment what the NFL often tried to mask. That beneath the spectacle, football was still a dangerous game that could end lives and careers in an instant. And yet, the league moved forward. Theismann's injury became a part of highlight history, remembered as much for its shock value as for its tragedy. This was the paradox of the 1980s NFL. The violence wasn't hidden. It was packaged, sold, and replayed, a reminder that suffering had become part of the entertainment. I think often about the players who lived in the shadows of the stars. Men whose names never reached national headlines, but who carried the bruises just the same. For every Montana or Taylor, there were dozens of linemen whose knees were wrecked before age 30, whose hands became twisted from years of trench warfare. Their sacrifices built the empire, but their stories rarely left the locker room. The 1980s also saw the rise of the hitmen, defensive players who built reputations on intimidation. Ronnie Lott, the legendary San Francisco 49ers safety, is remembered not just for his interceptions, but for the way he punished receivers who dared to cross the middle of the field. Lott once famously amputated part of his finger rather than miss playing time. That kind of sacrifice was celebrated as toughness, as proof of dedication. But in reality, it was another reminder of how deeply the culture demanded that players surrender their bodies for the game. The league itself benefited from this culture of glorified pain. NFL films continued to craft mythology from blood and sweat. Vicenda's voice still echoed, though his death in 1984 marked the end of an era. The torch was passed to the networks, who used modern production to amplify the spectacle. Halftime shows grew more elaborate. Super Bowl commercials became cultural events. And the NFL became a stage not just for athletes, but for America itself. Still, the hardships lingered behind the curtain. Concussions remained misunderstood and untreated. Players were often injected with painkillers to stay on the field. Surgeries were common, rehabilitation rushed. The mantra was simple: the team needed you, and you played, no matter the cost. Doctors were part of the machine, patching men up just enough to send them back into battle. For players, saying no wasn't an option. Careers were short, competition was fierce, and the unspoken rule was clear: endure or be replaced. The decade also brought labor disputes that revealed just how fragile the players' power was. In 1987, a player strike led to 3 weeks of games played with replacements, scabs as they were called. Owners held firm, showing that even when athletes demanded better treatment and fairer wages, the machine could keep rolling without them. Fans kept watching, television kept broadcasting. The message was unmistakable: no individual player was bigger than the league. That realization carried a deep weight because it meant that no matter how much glory a star achieved, his body was still expendable in the larger system. And yet, the spectacle was irresistible. The Super Bowl became the most watched event in America, a cultural holiday. Players became household names, their faces on cereal boxes, their stories woven into national lore. The NFL had conquered television, but it had also hardened its culture. To be a player in the 1980s was to live with contradiction, celebrated as a hero, but treated as a tool. Worshipped on Sundays, but forgotten when the body gave out. When I reflect on the 1980s, I see it as the decade when the NFL perfected its double life. It was the golden age of marketing, when football became a brand as powerful as Coca-Cola or McDonald's. But the price of that branding was blood. Every commercial break, every halftime performance, every highlight reel was built on the foundation of sacrifice. The public saw heroes. The players felt the pain. Lawrence Taylor once admitted that his ferocity on the field was fueled by chaos off it. His lifestyle was reckless, his body constantly in jeopardy, but his legend grew because of it. That duality, glory and destruction intertwined, wasn't unique to him. It was the story of the decade itself. The 1980s didn't soften football. They didn't tame its violence. They dressed it up, lit it under brighter spotlights, and sold it to millions. But for the men inside the game, the hardships never left. They just became easier for the public to ignore, hidden beneath the glitter of America's favorite show. The decade ended with the NFL on top of the sporting world. The Super Bowl was a national holiday. The stars were icons. The league was rich beyond imagination. But the cost of broken bodies, the shattered lives, was still there, unpaid. And it would haunt the decades to come. The 1980s were a decade of spectacle. If the 1970s had forged the NFL into a national institution, the 1980s turned it into America's obsession. The sport became louder, flashier, and more commercial than ever before. From neon uniforms to booming halftime shows, the NFL was no longer content to be just a game. It wanted to be culture itself. Yet beneath the glitter of endorsements and television contracts, the violence remained. In fact, as the league expanded its reach, the brutality only deepened. A sack by Taylor wasn't just a tackle, it was a highlight played endlessly on Monday Night Football. Montana's calm brilliance, orchestrating comebacks under the harshest blitzes, made him an icon. And Peyton, known as Sweetness, ran with such elegance that fans often forgot the punishment he absorbed every Sunday. The heroes of this era were celebrated not in spite of the hardships, but because they endured them with style. Television transformed football into theater. The arrival of cable networks, especially ESPN in 1979, changed everything. Suddenly, fans didn't just see their team once a week, they saw highlights every night. Every bone-rattling hit, every moment of chaos was replayed in slow motion. Violence was now part of the brand. Fans could marvel at the artistry of Montana's passes, then gasp at the devastation of a Taylor sack, all in the same highlight reel. It was the perfect product for a decade obsessed with drama and excess. But the brutality had consequences. Consider Joe Theismann, quarterback for Washington. In 1985, during a Monday Night Football game, his career ended instantly when Lawrence Taylor sacked him. Theismann's leg snapped gruesomely on national television. The sound, the sight, the horror, it was unforgettable. Millions of viewers saw in that moment what the NFL often tried to mask. That beneath the spectacle. Football was still a dangerous game that could end lives and careers in an instant. And yet, the league moved forward. Theismann's injury became a part of highlight history, remembered as much for its shock value as for its tragedy. This was the paradox of the 1980s NFL. The violence wasn't hidden. It was packaged, sold, and replayed, a reminder that suffering had become part of the entertainment. I think often about the players who lived in the shadows of the stars. Men whose names never reached national headlines, but who carried the bruises just the same. For every Montana or Taylor, there were dozens of linemen whose knees were wrecked before age 30, whose hands became twisted from years of trench warfare. Their sacrifices built the empire, but their stories rarely left the locker room. The 1980s also saw the rise of the hit men, defensive players who built reputations on intimidation. Ronnie Lott, the legendary San Francisco 49ers safety, is remembered not just for his interceptions, but for the way he punished receivers who dared to cross the middle of the field. Lott once famously amputated part of his finger rather than miss playing time. That kind of sacrifice was celebrated as toughness, as proof of dedication. But in reality, it was another reminder of how deeply the culture demanded that players surrender their bodies for the game. The league itself benefited from this culture of glorified pain. NFL films continued to craft mythology from blood and sweat. Facenda's voice still echoed, though his death in 1984 marked the end of an era. The torch was passed to the networks, who used modern production to amplify the spectacle. Halftime shows grew more elaborate, Super Bowl commercials became cultural events, and the NFL became a stage not just for athletes, but for America itself. Still, the hardships lingered behind the curtain. Concussions remained misunderstood and untreated. Players were often injected with painkillers to stay on the field. Surgeries were common. Rehabilitation rushed. The mantra was simple. The team needed you, and you played, no matter the cost. Doctors were part of the machine, patching men up just enough to send them back into battle. For players, saying no wasn't an option. Careers were short. Competition was fierce, and the unspoken rule was clear. Endure or be replaced. The decade also brought labor disputes that revealed just how fragile the players' power was. In 1987, a player strike led to 3 weeks of games played with replacements, scabs, as they were called. Owners held firm, showing that even when athletes demanded better treatment and fairer wages, the machine could keep rolling without them. Fans kept watching. Television kept broadcasting. The message was unmistakable. No individual player was bigger than the league. That realization carried a deep weight, because it meant that no matter how much glory a star achieved, his body was still expendable in the larger system. And yet, the spectacle was irresistible. The Super Bowl became the most watched event in America, a cultural holiday. Players became household names, their faces on cereal boxes, their stories woven into national lore. The NFL had conquered television, but it had also hardened its culture. To be a player in the 1980s was to live with contradiction. Celebrated as a hero, but treated as a tool. Worshipped on Sundays, but forgotten when the body gave out. When I reflect on the 1980s, I see it as the decade when the NFL perfected its double life. It was the golden age of marketing, when football became a brand as powerful as Coca-Cola or McDonald's. But the price of that branding was blood. Every commercial break, every halftime performance, every highlight reel was built on the foundation of sacrifice. The public saw heroes. The players felt the pain. Lawrence Taylor once admitted that his ferocity on the field was fueled by chaos off it. His lifestyle was reckless, his body constantly in jeopardy, but his legend grew because of it. That duality, glory and destruction intertwined, wasn't unique to him. It was the story of the decade itself. The 1980s didn't soften football. They didn't tame its violence. They dressed it up, lit it under brighter spotlights, and sold it to millions. But for the men inside the game, the hardships never left. They just became easier for the public to ignore, hidden beneath the glitter of America's favorite show. The decade ended with the NFL on top of the sporting world. The Super Bowl was a national holiday. The stars were icons. The league was rich beyond imagination. But the cost, the broken bodies, the shattered lives was still there, unpaid, and it would haunt the decades to come. The 2000s were a decade of transformation, a time when the NFL not only cemented its place as America, as dominant sport, but also began to wrestle with shadows it could no longer fully ignore. The league entered the new millennium with unprecedented confidence. It had weathered labor disputes, expanded into new markets, and redefined what it meant to be a cultural institution. Football wasn't just a pastime anymore, it was a ritual woven into the identity of American life. Sundays belonged to the NFL, and increasingly, so did Mondays, Thursdays, and eventually nearly every conversation around sports. Yet as the league soared to new heights, the very violence that had fueled its rise started to unravel its carefully curated image. The decade began under the shadow of national tragedy. On September 11, 2001, the United States was shaken by the terrorist attacks that would redefine a generation. In the immediate aftermath, the NFL postponed its games for a week, a rare pause in its relentless schedule. When play resumed, football became more than a sport. It was a stage for grief, unity, and defiance. Stadiums swelled with patriotic displays. Flags covered the fields, players and fans held moments of silence, and the national anthem became an anthem of resilience. In those first Sundays after 9/11s, football was a refuge, a place where millions sought normalcy amid chaos. The NFL leaned into this role, branding itself as a symbol of American strength. And in that environment, a dynasty was born. The New England Patriots, led by a young, unassuming quarterback named Tom Brady, rose from obscurity to dominance. When Brady stepped in for the injured Drew Bledsoe in 2001, few imagined the dynasty he would build. But his calm under pressure, paired with Bill Belichick's ruthless strategic genius, created the perfect storm. The Patriots won their first Super Bowl that season, stunning the St. Louis Rams in one of the greatest upsets in NFL history. Over the next decade, Brady and Belichick would reshape football, proving that meticulous preparation and cold efficiency could conquer even the flashiest opponents. The Patriots' rise reflected the mood of post-9/11's America. They weren't flamboyant. They weren't larger-than-life personalities. They were disciplined, methodical, and relentless. Their dynasty embodied the virtues of order and control in a time when the nation craved stability. Yet their success also revealed the darker side of competition. Spygate, the scandal involving the Patriots filming opponents' signals, tainted their reputation and raised questions about how far teams would go to gain an edge. It was a reminder that in the NFL, winning wasn't just everything, yet was the only thing. While dynasties captivated fans, technology changed how football was consumed. The rise of digital media in the 2000s transformed the fan experience. The internet brought highlights, analysis, and rumors into people's homes instantly. Websites like ESPN.com and later Bleacher Report made football a 24/7 obsession. Fantasy football, once a niche pastime, exploded with the advent of online leagues. Suddenly, fans weren't just watching games. They were tracking every yard, every touchdown, every injury. The NFL's partnership with fantasy platforms turned casual fans into year-round participants, deepening engagement while also commodifying players in new ways. For many, athletes were no longer people, they were stats, assets in a digital game. The spectacle of the Super Bowl reached levels never before imagined. Each February, the game drew audiences in the hundreds of millions worldwide. Halftime shows became cultural events unto themselves. From U2's emotional 2002 tribute to the victims of 9/11 to Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake's infamous 2004 performance that sparked national controversy. The Super Bowl was no longer just a championship, was America's most watched ritual, equal parts sport, concert, and advertising bonanza. The NFL had succeeded in making itself indispensable to the fabric of national life. Yet as the league grew, so did the bodies of the men who played it. Players in the 2000s were faster, stronger, and more specialized than ever before. Offensive linemen routinely topped 300 pounds while retaining agility. Defensive ends became freakish athletes, capable of chasing down quarterbacks with terrifying speed. The collisions on the field were no longer just violent, they were seismic. Fans thrilled at the spectacle. Broadcasters glorified the big hits, and NFL films packaged violence as art. But the cost was becoming harder to ignore. The concussion crisis began to take shape in the 2000s, even as the league tried to keep it in the shadows. For decades, concussions were dismissed as part of the game. Players who staggered to the sideline were praised if they returned quickly. But studies in the early 2000s, particularly the groundbreaking research of Dr. Bennett Omalu, began to link repetitive head trauma to long-term brain damage. The discovery of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, threatened to upend everything the NFL had built. The league responded with denial, launching committees that downplayed the risks and attacking the credibility of researchers. But the stories of former players struggling with memory loss, depression, and early death could not be silenced forever. The case of former Pittsburgh Steelers center Mike Webster became a haunting symbol. Webster, once known as Iron Mike, had been the cornerstone of Pittsburgh's offensive line during its dynasty years. But after retirement, his life unraveled. He suffered from cognitive decline, depression, and chronic pain, eventually dying at the age of 50 in 2002. Omalu's examination of Webster's brain revealed evidence of CTE, sparking a storm of controversy that would grow louder in the years ahead. Webster's tragic story was the crack in the facade, the first undeniable proof that the game's violence left scars that no highlight reel could glamorize. Other players' struggles echoed the same theme. Linebacker Al Toon, wide receiver Wayne Krabat, and countless others retired early after repeated concussions. Their stories were whispered in locker rooms, shared among fans in hushed tones, but the NFL pressed forward, its empire too vast to slow down. The spectacle demanded continuity, and continuity required silence. Meanwhile, the culture of toughness persisted. Brett Favre, still a dominant figure in the 2000s, extended his Ironman streak to 297 consecutive starts, often playing through injuries that would sideline others. His resilience was celebrated as legendary. Yet every hit he absorbed, every concussion he dismissed, reinforced the dangerous mythology of football, that true greatness meant enduring endless punishment. For young fans, Favre was a hero. For future generations of players, he was also an impossible standard. The 2000s were also the decade of stars who transcended the sport. Peyton Manning, with his cerebral approach and relentless preparation, redefined what it meant to be a quarterback. LaDainian Tomlinson dazzled fans with his versatility, putting up video game numbers that made him a fantasy football legend. Ray Lewis turned defense into theater, his fiery speeches and bone-crushing hits making him the face of Baltimore's identity. These players gave the NFL personalities that were both inspirational and marketable, humanizing the league even as its scale grew beyond comprehension. Yet, even amid these triumphs, tragedy lingered. In 2007, Sean Taylor of the Washington Redskins was killed in a home invasion, shocking the football world and reminding fans of the fragility of life beyond the field. His death became a moment of national mourning. A story that transcended sports and highlighted how deeply football players had embedded themselves in American culture. By the decade's end, the NFL was more powerful than ever. Television contracts reached billions. Fantasy football was a national obsession, and the Super Bowl had become the most watched broadcast on earth. The league had achieved its dream of dominance. But it had also planted the seeds of its greatest reckoning. The concussion crisis was no longer a whisper, was a storm on the horizon. Former players were filing lawsuits, researchers were refusing to be silenced, and fans were beginning to ask questions the NFL could no longer avoid. The 2000s were an age of contradictions. Football was never more beautiful, never more captivating, never more embedded in the national soul. Yet it was also never more dangerous, never more questioned, and never more at risk of exposing the human cost beneath the spectacle. As the decade ended, with Drew Brees and the New Orleans Saints triumphing in Super Bowl 44, the NFL stood as an empire without rival. But empires built on denial eventually faced their truth. The 2010s would force football to confront its greatest crisis yet, the era when the hidden costs of violence could no longer remain hidden. The 2000s were a decade of transformation, a time when the NFL not only cemented its place as America's dominant sport, but also began to wrestle with shadows it could no longer fully ignore. The league entered the new millennium with unprecedented confidence. It had weathered labor disputes, expanded into new markets, and redefined what it meant to be a cultural institution. Football wasn't just a pastime anymore, was a ritual woven into the identity of American life. Sundays belonged to the NFL, and increasingly, so did Mondays, Thursdays, and eventually nearly every conversation around sports. Yet as the league soared to new heights, the very violence that had fueled its rise started to unravel its carefully curated image. The decade began under the shadow of national tragedy. On September 11, 2001, the United States was shaken by the terrorist attacks that would redefine a generation. In the immediate aftermath, the NFL postponed its games for a week, a rare pause in its relentless schedule. When play resumed, football became more than a sport. It was a stage for grief, unity, and defiance. Stadiums swelled with patriotic displays. Flags covered the fields, players and fans held moments of silence, and the national anthem became an anthem of resilience. In those first Sundays after 9/11, football was a refuge, a place where millions sought normalcy amid chaos. The NFL leaned into this role, branding itself as a symbol of American strength. And in that environment, a dynasty was born. The New England Patriots, led by a young, unassuming quarterback named Tom Brady, rose from obscurity to dominance. When Brady stepped in for the injured Drew Bledsoe in 2001, few imagined the dynasty he would build. But his calm under pressure, paired with Bill Belichick's ruthless strategic genius, created the perfect storm. The Patriots won their first Super Bowl that season, stunning the St. Louis Rams in one of the greatest upsets in NFL history. Over the next decade, Brady and Belichick would reshape football, proving that meticulous preparation and cold efficiency could conquer even the flashiest opponents. The Patriots' rise reflected the mood of post-9/11's America. They weren't flamboyant. They weren't larger-than-life personalities. They were disciplined, methodical, and relentless. Their dynasty embodied the virtues of order and control in a time when the nation craved stability. Yet their success also revealed the darker side of competition. Spygate, the scandal involving the Patriots filming opponents' signals, tainted their reputation and raised questions about how far teams would go to gain an edge. It was a reminder that in the NFL, winning wasn't just everything yet was the only thing. While dynasties captivated fans, technology changed how football was consumed. The rise of digital media in the 2000s transformed the fan experience. The internet brought highlights, analysis, and rumors into people's homes instantly. Websites like ESPN.com and later Bleacher Report made football a 24/7 obsession. Fantasy football, once a niche pastime, exploded with the advent of online leagues. Suddenly, fans weren't just watching games. They were tracking every yard, every touchdown, every injury. The NFL's partnership with fantasy platforms turned casual fans into year-round participants, deepening engagement while also commodifying players in new ways. For many, athletes were no longer people, they were stats, assets in a digital game. The spectacle of the Super Bowl reached levels never before imagined. Each February, the game drew audiences in the hundreds of millions worldwide. Halftime shows became cultural events unto themselves. From U2's emotional 2002 tribute to the victims of 9/11 to Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake's infamous 2004 performance that sparked national controversy. The Super Bowl was no longer just a championship, was America's most watched ritual, equal parts sport, concert, and advertising bonanza. The NFL had succeeded in making itself indispensable to the fabric of national life. Yet as the league grew, so did the bodies of the men who played it. Players in the 2000s were faster, stronger, and more specialized than ever before. Offensive linemen routinely topped 300 pounds while retaining agility. Defensive ends became freakish athletes, capable of chasing down quarterbacks with terrifying speed. The collisions on the field were no longer just violent, they were seismic. Fans thrilled at the spectacle. Broadcasters glorified the big hits, and NFL films packaged violence as art. But the cost was becoming harder to ignore. The concussion crisis began to take shape in the 2000s, even as the league tried to keep it in the shadows. For decades, concussions were dismissed as part of the game. Players who staggered to the sideline were praised if they returned quickly. But studies in the early 2000s, particularly the groundbreaking research of Dr. Bennett Omalu, began to link repetitive head trauma to long-term brain damage. The discovery of chronic traumatic encephalopathy (CTE) threatened to upend everything the NFL had built. The league responded with denial, launching committees that downplayed the risks and attacking the credibility of researchers. But the stories of former players struggling with memory loss, depression, and early death could not be silenced forever. The case of former Pittsburgh Steelers center Mike Webster became a haunting symbol. Webster, once known as Iron Mike, had been the cornerstone of Pittsburgh's offensive line during its dynasty years. But after retirement, his life unraveled. He suffered from cognitive decline, depression, and chronic pain, eventually dying at the age of 50 in 2002. Omalu's examination of Webster's brain revealed evidence of CTE, sparking a storm of controversy that would grow louder in the years ahead. Webster's tragic story was the crack in the facade, the first undeniable proof that the game's violence left scars that no highlight reel could glamorize. Other players' struggles echoed the same theme. Linebacker Al Toon, wide receiver Wayne Crabat, and countless others retired early after repeated concussions. Their stories were whispered in locker rooms, shared among fans in hushed tones, but the NFL pressed forward, its empire too vast to slow down. The spectacle demanded continuity, and continuity required silence. Meanwhile, the culture of toughness persisted. Brett Favre, still a dominant figure in the 2000s, extended his Ironman streak to 297 consecutive starts, often playing through injuries that would sideline others. His resilience was celebrated as legendary. Yet every hit he absorbed, every concussion he dismissed, reinforced the dangerous mythology of football, that true greatness meant enduring endless punishment. For young fans, Favre was a hero. For future generations of players, he was also an impossible standard. The 2000s were also the decade of stars who transcended the sport. Peyton Manning, with his cerebral approach and relentless preparation, redefined what it meant to be a quarterback. LaDainian Tomlinson dazzled fans with his versatility, putting up video game numbers that made him a fantasy football legend. Ray Lewis turned defense into theater, his fiery speeches and bone-crushing hits making him the face of Baltimore's identity. These players gave the NFL personalities that were both inspirational and marketable. humanizing the league even as its scale grew beyond comprehension. Yet, even amid these triumphs, tragedy lingered. In 2007, Sean Taylor of the Washington Redskins was killed in a home invasion, shocking the football world and reminding fans of the fragility of life beyond the field. His death became a moment of national mourning, a story that transcended sports and highlighted how deeply football players had embedded themselves in American culture. By the decade's end, the NFL was more powerful than ever. Television contracts reached billions. Fantasy football was a national obsession, and the Super Bowl had become the most watched broadcast on earth. The league had achieved its dream of dominance. But it had also planted the seeds of its greatest reckoning. The concussion crisis was no longer a whisper, was a storm on the horizon. Former players were filing lawsuits, researchers were refusing to be silenced, and fans were beginning to ask questions the NFL could no longer avoid. The 2000s were an age of contradictions. Football was never more beautiful, never more captivating, never more embedded in the national soul. Yet it was also never more dangerous, never more questioned, and never more at risk of exposing the human cost beneath the spectacle. As the decade ended, with Drew Brees and the New Orleans Saints triumphing in Super Bowl 44, the NFL stood as an empire without rival. But empires built on denial eventually face their truth. The 2010s would force football to confront its greatest crisis yet, the era when the hidden costs of violence could no longer remain hidden. The 2020s began with uncertainty that no league, no player, and no fan could have imagined. When the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe in early 2020, professional sports were forced into uncharted territory. For the NFL league built on spectacle, packed stadiums, and the communal ritual of Sunday afternoons, the very foundations of its empire were shaken. Would football even be possible in a world of lockdowns and empty arenas? Could America's favorite sport survive when human contact itself had become dangerous? The answer, of course, was yes. But the way the NFL navigated the pandemic revealed much about its power, its flaws, and its future. The 2020 season became a high-wire act of testing, quarantines, and contingency plans. Teams played in empty stadiums, their roars replaced by artificial crowd noise pumped through speakers for television audiences. Masks covered the sidelines, players were shuffled in and out of COVID protocols, and entire games were rescheduled on short notice. The Denver Broncos were famously forced to play a game without a single eligible quarterback, turning to practice squad receiver Kendall Hinton in one of the most surreal moments in league history. Yet, somehow, the NFL pressed forward, determined to deliver a complete season when other sports had faltered. Super Bowl LV, held in February 2021, became a symbol of this resilient sand of the league's ability to spin chaos into spectacle. In a half-empty stadium in Tampa, Tom Brady, now in a Buccaneers uniform, dismantled Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs to claim his 7th Lombardi trophy. It was a stunning reminder that even in the most unstable of times, football could still produce mythic moments. The image of Brady, at 43 years old, hoisting the trophy was both inspiring and unsettling. How long could one man defy the clock in a sport that had broken so many others? But the pandemic was only one part of the 2020 story. This decade has also been marked by cultural conflict, technological change, and the continued collision of money and morality. One of the defining themes has been the NFL's evolving relationship with gambling. What was once taboo is now a cornerstone of the business model. Following the Supreme Court's 2018 decision to legalize sports betting, the league plunged headfirst into partnerships with sportsbooks, casinos, and fantasy platforms. By the early 2020s, advertisements for DraftKings, FanDuel, and Caesars were nearly as common during broadcasts as beer and truck commercials. Fans could bet on every aspect of a game, from the coin toss to the number of yards Mahomes would throw for in a given quarter. The line between fandom and gambling blurred to the point of near erasure. This embrace of betting brought massive revenue, but it also carried risks. In 2022, Atlanta Falcons receiver Calvin Ridley was suspended for a full season after being caught wagering on NFL games. Other players soon followed, caught up in scandals that underscored the uneasy balance between promoting gambling and punishing those who cross the league as carefully drawn lines. The NFL's position was paradoxical. It wanted fans to gamble more than ever before, but it demanded players stay entirely clear of the very industry the league now profited from. The controversies revealed both the fragility and hypocrisy of the NFL's new money machine. While gambling altered the financial landscape, health remained the sport's most pressing existential question. If the 2010s had been about concussions, the 2020s added new dimensions of visible trauma. In January 2023, the world watched in horror as Buffalo Bills safety Damar Hamlin collapsed on the field during a Monday Night Football game, after suffering cardiac arrest following a tackle. For nearly 10 minutes, players from both teams knelt in tears as medical personnel performed CPR, fighting to save his life. The game was suspended, and millions of viewers were left to grapple with the raw reality of what they were watching. Football wasn't just dangerous, it could be deadly, in real time, under the brightest lights. Hamlin survived, a testament to medical preparedness and sheer fortune. His recovery became one of the most inspirational stories of the decade, celebrated as a triumph of resilience. Yet his collapse also raised questions about how far the NFL could stretch the narrative of heroism to cover the dangers of the game. When players cried openly on the field, when fans saw not just broken bones, but a life nearly lost before their eyes, could they ever see football the same way again? Despite these challenges, the 2020s have also produced some of the most exciting football in history, led by a new generation of stars who have redefined the game's possibilities. Patrick Mahomes has already cemented himself as the face of the league, winning 2 Super Bowls by age 27 and dazzling fans with throws that seem to defy physics. His blend of creativity, toughness, and showmanship embodies what modern football craves. Not just precision, but spectacle. He has been joined by a new wave of quarterbacks. Josh Allen in Buffalo, whose rocket arm and bulldozing runs make him a one-man highlight reel. Joe Burrow in Cincinnati, whose poise and swagger have revived a franchise long synonymous with futility. And Jalen Hurts in Philadelphia, whose leadership and versatility nearly delivered the Eagles a championship in May 2023. These players represent not just a generational shift, but a philosophical one. The 2020s quarterback is expected to be both passer and playmaker, blending traditional pocket skills with the improvisational flair of street football. But perhaps no quarterback has embodied the cultural weight of the 2020s more than Lamar Jackson. His electrifying style, his refusal to conform to outdated ideas about what a quarterback should be, and his public contract battles with the Baltimore Ravens turned him into a symbol of player empowerment. Jackson's eventual record-breaking deal in 2023 reflected not just his value on the field, but a broader shift in how players were beginning to leverage their worth in negotiations with billion-dollar franchises. The decade has also seen an evolution in how players use their voices. Following the racial justice protests of 2020, the NFL publicly committed to social justice initiatives, even placing slogans like "End Racism" in end zones. Yet skepticism lingered. Many remembered how Colin Kaepernick had been sidelined years earlier for kneeling, and wondered whether the league's new activism was genuine or performative. Still, the visibility of players as activists, entrepreneurs, and cultural figures has never been higher. From podcasts to fashion ventures to investment firms, modern stars are building empires beyond the gridiron, refusing to be defined solely by the violence of their profession. Meanwhile, the business of football has grown ever more extravagant. The NFL's streaming deals with Amazon Prime, YouTube, and other platforms have expanded its reach far beyond traditional television. Stadiums have become billion-dollar palaces, complete with luxury suites, digital scoreboards, the size of apartment buildings. and Wi-Fi networks powerful enough to support tens of thousands of fans live streaming the game they already attending. The league's ambitions are global, with games in London, Munich, and Mexico City laying the groundwork for what many believe will eventually be a permanent international franchise. Yet, with expansion comes vulnerability. Each year, participation rates in youth football face new scrutiny as parents weigh the risks of concussions, heat stroke, and long-term injuries. While the NFL insists it is safer than ever, critics argue that the very essence of the sport cannot be sanitized. It is still, at its core, about collisions, impact, and the toll of repetition. The Hamlin incident made clear that danger cannot be legislated away, only endured. As the decade progresses, the NFL finds itself caught in a paradox that has defined much of its history. The more dangerous the game becomes, the more spectacular it seems to its fans. Every Mahomes scramble, every diving catch, every bone-rattling tackle carries with it the thrill of risk. That risk is what draws millions of viewers every Sunday, even as it drives players into early retirement and fuels endless debates about morality. The NFL is both a marvel and a mirror, reflecting America's hunger for glory and its willingness to ignore what glory costs. By the mid-2020s, one thing is clear: football is not going anywhere. Its grip on American culture remains unshakable, even as the controversies pile higher. Gambling, injuries, activism, expansion, all of these are storms the NFL must navigate, but none have loosened its hold on the public imagination. If anything, they have deepened the fascination. Fans don't just want the game anymore. They want the drama, the scandal, the humanity, the triumph, and the tragedy. Football has become not just a sport, but a serialized saga unfolding every week in real time with stakes that feel Shakespearean. The 2020s may yet prove to be the decade when football reaches both its peak and its breaking point. The league is richer, flashier, and more popular than ever. But it is also more vulnerable, more exposed, and more dependent on the very players whose health it endangers. How long that balance can hold remains an open question. For now, though, the story continues. The lights come on, the anthem plays. The kickoff sails through the air and millions watch, holding their breath, knowing that in this game, anything can happen. The NFL of the 2020s is more than just a sports league. It is a cultural colossus, a billion-dollar machine, and an institution that shapes how millions of people spend their Sundays, their money, and their emotional energy. But with that power comes scrutiny. No longer can the league hide behind this simple narrative of competition and glory. In today's world, football is inseparable from questions of morality, culture, economics, and identity. To analyze the modern NFL is to ask not just how the game is played, but what it means and what it costs. At the center of this reckoning is the question of violence. Football has always been dangerous, but the NFL has spent decades presenting that danger as entertainment. Highlight reels celebrate the hardest hits, commentators praise toughness, and fans marvel at the spectacle. Yet the stories of players suffering long-term damage, CTE, memory loss, depression, early deaths, force a reckoning. Can a sport that thrives on destruction ever be truly ethical? The league's answer has often been contradictory. On one hand, it touts improved safety protocols, better helmets, stricter concussion protocols, new rules designed to limit head contact. On the other hand, it packages violence as its most marketable commodity. The league's most viral clips are often brutal sacks, devastating tackles, or collisions that leave athletes writhing on the turf. The product being sold is not safety, is spectacle. This contradiction defines the NFL's cultural identity, and it is not just about what happens on the field. The NFL has become a mirror for America's broader cultural debates. Consider the issue of race. The majority of NFL players are black, while the majority of team owners are white billionaires. The power imbalance is stark, and it has fueled decades of tension. Colin Kaepernick's decision to kneel during the national anthem in 2016 brought this tension to the forefront. His protest against police brutality ignited a firestorm. The NFL responded not with support, but with silence and effectively blackballing him from the league. Only later, as public sentiments shifted after George Floyd's murder in 2020, did the NFL embrace racial justice messaging. End zones were painted with "End Racism." Players were encouraged to use their platforms. But many fans and players saw it as too little to light a corporate attempt at damage control rather than true reform. The Kaepernick saga remains a cultural fault line. To some, it represents the courage of an athlete who sacrificed his career for justice. To others, it shows the NFL's willingness to silence dissent to protect profits. The league's eventual shift toward embracing social causes illustrates its sensitivity to public opinion, but also its tendency to treat activism as branding rather than conviction. This duality raises the question: is the NFL a leader in cultural change, or simply a follower of consumer sentiment? The issue of labor adds another layer. For all the wealth surrounding the NFL, the players themselves often face economic precarity. Yes, stars like Patrick Mahomes or Aaron Donald secure contracts worth hundreds of millions. But the average NFL career lasts less than 4 years. Many players leave the league with few savings, battered bodies, and uncertain futures. The structure of contracts, heavy on non-guaranteed money, leaves even accomplished veterans vulnerable to sudden unemployment. The juxtaposition is stark. Billionaire owners profiting from a sport built on the expendability of young men. This dynamic becomes even more troubling when considering the demographic pipeline. Many players come from disadvantaged backgrounds, funneled into football as one of the few viable paths to economic mobility. For countless families, football is seen as salvation, a ticket out of poverty. But that salvation often comes at a price. Years of bodily sacrifice for a career that may end in a flash. Ethically, it raises questions about exploitation. Is football offering opportunity, or is it extracting labor and health from vulnerable communities for the benefit of corporate empires? The role of gender cannot be ignored either. The NFL markets heavily to women and boasts some of the largest female fan bases of any sport. Yet its track record with gender issues is fraught. High-profile cases of domestic violence involving players from Ray Rice's infamous 2014 elevator video to more recent incidents have put the league under intense scrutiny. The NFL has often been accused of leniency, inconsistency, or outright indifference when disciplining players for off-field violence against women. Each case reignites debate over whether the league prioritizes morality or marketability. When a star player is involved, the balance often tips toward protecting the brand rather than confronting the issue head-on. Meanwhile, the rise of women in football as fans, referees, coaches, and executives marks progress but also highlights ongoing inequities. Women are no longer outsiders in the NFL ecosystem. Sarah Thomas became the first female Super Bowl official in 2021. Coaches like Katie Sowers and Jennifer King broke barriers on NFL sidelines. Yet these milestones often feel like exceptions, tokenized moments rather than evidence of structural inclusion. The NFL wants credit for progress, but systemic change remains slow. Then there is the role of fandom itself. To be an NFL fan in the 21st century is to live with contradictions. You cheer for the beauty of the game, the impossible catches, the heroic comebacks. But you also know, whether you admit it or not, that the very moments you celebrate often come at devastating cost to the players who provide them. Every touchdown catch might mean a concussion absorbed weeks earlier. Every sack cheered in the stands might mean a shortened lifespan for the man on the ground. The ethical dilemma is baked into the act of fandom, loving a sport that destroys its heroes. This tension mirrors America's broader cultural paradoxes. The NFL thrives in a society obsessed with entertainment, profit, and spectacle, even when those come at the expense of human well-being. Football is not an aberration, it is an extension of cultural values. It embodies both the best and worst of American life. resilience and risk, unity and exploitation, triumph and tragedy. The league's expansion into global markets underscores these dynamics. In London, Munich, and Mexico City, international fans are introduced to the NFL as a glamorous spectacle. But exporting the product also means exporting the ethical dilemmas. If the NFL places a permanent team in Europe, will those fans grapple with the same contradictions Americans face? Or will distance make it easier to ignore the costs? Economically, the NFL sits at the top of the sports world. Its television contracts, streaming deals, and sponsorships are unmatched. Super Bowl ads cost millions of dollars for 30 seconds of airtime. Teams are valued in the billions. Owners wield influence not just in sports, but in politics, business, and culture. The league's financial power makes it nearly untouchable. And yet, money cannot insulate it from moral questions. In fact, the more profitable the NFL becomes, the more its critics argue that it has a responsibility to reckon with the harm it causes. The cultural centrality of the NFL also magnifies its symbolic weight. When millions of people gather every Sunday to watch, the league becomes a stage where America sees itself. The anthem, the halftime show, the commercials, the athlete sit is all part of a national mirror. And in that mirror, the contradictions are glaring. Football unites families and friends, yet divides over politics. It inspires young athletes, yet leaves veterans broken. It represents achievement and opportunity, yet thrives on exploitation. The ethical debate surrounding football is unlikely to resolve neatly. For every argument about exploitation, there is a counterpoint about agency. Players know the risks, sign the contracts, and reap enormous rewards if successful. For every critique of violence, there is a defense of football's beauty, strategy, and cultural significance. For every scandal, there is a counterweight of charity work, community building, and inspiration. The truth lies in the tension, not in resolution. As the NFL moves deeper into the 2020s, it faces a choice. It can continue to package violence as entertainment, leaning on denial and distraction when the costs become too visible. Or it can confront its contradictions honestly, investing in player health, labor rights, and cultural accountability in ways that match its immense power. Either path carries risks. Transparency might threaten the mythology that sustains fandom. Denial might invite a backlash too powerful to contain. The NFL's cultural significance guarantees that its decisions ripple far beyond the field. They shape conversations about race, gender, health, economics, and identity across American society. In this way, football is not just a sport, it is a battleground for the values of a nation. To watch the modern NFL is to watch a story of grandeur and fragility, dominance and doubt. It is to witness a game that gives joy and takes lives, that unites millions while exploiting the few, that embodies both aspiration and cost. In the end, the cultural and ethical reckoning of football is not just the NFL's story. It is America's story, written in touchdowns and concussions, in contracts and protests, in cheers and silences. And like America itself, the NFL remains suspended between triumph and tragedy, unsure which will define its legacy. The NFL today stands as the most powerful sports league on earth. Its revenues eclipse those of baseball, basketball, and hockey combined. Its championship game, the Super Bowl, is not merely a sporting event, but a cultural ritual, drawing audiences that rival the largest global spectacles. Stadiums rise like cathedrals, television contracts flow like rivers of gold, and stars are elevated into modern-day heroes. For millions, football is a weekly rhythm, as much a part of life as work, family, or faith. Yet with all this dominance comes a reckoning, a recognition that the empire of football, for all its triumphs, is perched precariously between glory and collapse. The paradox of the NFL is striking. Never has it been more popular. Never has it been more profitable. And yet, never has it faced more serious questions about its sustainability, its ethics, and its role in society. The same forces that built its empire, violence, spectacle, loyalty are now the very forces threatening to undo it. The league lives in contradiction. Beloved but criticized, powerful but fragile, central but embattled. To understand the NFL's present moment is to see a league at the crossroads, uncertain whether it will stride confidently into the future or stumble under the weight of its past. The shadows of violence at the heart of this tension lies the issue of violence. Football is violent by design. It is not an accident that players collide with crushing force. It is the essence of the game. But what once was seen as heroic sacrifice is now increasingly framed as preventable harm. The concussion crisis, once whispered, has become undeniable. Research into chronic traumatic cephalopathy (CTE) has revealed the devastating long-term effects of repeated head trauma. Former stars like Junior Seau, Dave Durson, and Vincent Jackson took their own lives, their autopsies confirming the disease's destructive power. Their tragedies have become haunting reminders that the highlight reels come with a hidden cost. The NFL has responded with reforms. Improved helmets, stricter concussion protocols, rules penalizing helmet-to-helmet contact. Yet these reforms are both necessary and insufficient. They acknowledge the problem, but cannot erase it. Football, at its core, will always involve collisions that human bodies are not built to endure. Every Sunday, fans cheer for plays that carry the risk of brain damage. The ethical tension is inescapable. Moreover, lawsuits from former players have forced the league to confront its past denials. The billion-dollar concussion settlement, while historic, has been plagued with controversy, with players accusing the NFL of dragging its feet on payouts and even racial discrimination in evaluating claims. For many, it confirmed what critics had long argued. The league's priority is not justice but damage control, the politics of the gridiron. Violence is not the only shadow. Politics has seeped into the NFL in ways that the league can no longer contain. The anthem protests of Colin Kaepernick and other players ignited debates that extended far beyond the field. For some, kneeling was an act of patriotism, a demand that America live up to its ideals. For others, it was an unforgivable breach of tradition. The NFL, caught between polarized audiences, stumbled in its response. Its initial silence and effective banishment of Kaepernick stained its reputation. Later attempts to embrace racial justice messaging struck many as hollow, too convenient, too late. But the protests did more than expose the NFL's corporate caution. They revealed how football is a national stage for America's cultural battles. Every anthem, every halftime show, every player statement is now scrutinized for political meaning. The league can no longer claim to be just a game. It is, inevitably, a reflection of the nation itself, its divisions, its aspirations, its hypocrisies. The economics of empire beyond politics, the economics of football, reveal further contradictions. The NFL is an empire built on both excess and scarcity. Owners reap billions, television networks pay record sums, and corporate sponsors line up to attach their brands to the shield. Yet the average player, the man who smashes his body week after week, faces a career lasting less than 4 years, often without guaranteed income or long-term support. This imbalance raises uncomfortable questions. Is the NFL an engine of opportunity, or is it an industry of exploitation? For young men from disadvantaged backgrounds, football often seems like a golden ticket. High school dreams funnel into college scholarships, and college dreams aim toward the draft. But the odds are merciless. Only a fraction make it to the NFL, and of those, only a few secure generational wealth. The rest leave with broken bodies, uncertain futures, and the knowledge that they were part of a system designed to replace them the moment they faltered. Fantasy football and sports betting have intensified this commodification. Fans track players as if they were stocks, reducing them to numbers, points, and odds. Injuries that devastate careers become mere inconveniences for fantasy lineups. The human cost is obscured by digital abstraction. For the league, however, these trends are profitable, deepening fan engagement and ensuring football's year-round dominance. The globalization questioned the NFL's ambitions extend beyond America's borders. Games in London, Munich, and Mexico City showcase football as a global export. The league dreams of planting franchises overseas, expanding its reach into markets where soccer reigns supreme. The vision is clear: to transform American football into a global brand like the NBA or FIFA's soccer empire. Yet questions linger. Will international audiences embrace a sport built on violence, spectacle, and uniquely American culture wars? Can the NFL sell its product abroad without exporting its ethical dilemmas? For now, international fans cheer the novelty of London games, but sustaining that interest requires more than spectacle. It requires cultural integration, a feat easier imagined than achieved. Gender and accountability. The NFL's cultural reckoning also includes questions of gender. The league has faced repeated scandals involving domestic violence, from Ray Rice's elevator assault to more recent cases like Deshaun Watson's alleged misconduct. Each incident has tested the NFL's disciplinary system and, more importantly, its values. Too often, critics argue, the league prioritizes protecting star players and minimizing controversy over supporting victims and taking decisive action. At the same time, women have made historic strides within football. Coaches like Katie Sowers, Jennifer King, and Lori Locust have broken barriers. Referee Sarah Thomas became the first woman to officiate a Super Bowl. These milestones are celebrated, but they also highlight the slow pace of change. Women are still underrepresented in leadership, coaching, and executive roles. The NFL markets itself as inclusive, but its power structures remain dominated by men. Fandom in the 21st century for the fans. The contradictions are perhaps the most personal. To love football is to live with discomfort. The game inspires all the fingertip catches, the impossible comebacks, the strategy unfolding like a chess match. It unites families, communities, and generations. Yet every fan also knows, deep down, that the joy comes at a cost. Players suffering concussions, enduring chronic pain, sacrificing decades of health for moments of glory. This awareness has not dimmed football's popularity, but it has complicated it. Parents hesitate to let children play. Documentaries like League of Denial and films like Concussion have peeled back the curtain. Fans argue about morality even as they fill stadiums and tune in every Sunday. The NFL thrives in this space of contradiction, a sport too beloved to abandon, too dangerous to ignore. The future at stake. As the NFL moves deeper into the 21st century, the stakes are clear. The league's future will be defined by how it navigates its contradictions. If it leans into denial, minimizing health risks, silencing dissent, prioritizing profit risks, a reckoning that could erode its cultural legitimacy. If it embraces reform, investing in player safety, confronting social issues honestly, sharing power more equitably, it may chart a sustainable path forward. Technology will shape this trajectory. Advances in medical science may produce safer helmets or better diagnostic tools, but no invention can make football risk-free. Virtual reality may deepen fan engagement, but it cannot substitute for the visceral thrill of live violence. Sports betting may expand revenues, but it also risks scandals that could undermine trust. The very innovations that propel the NFL forward may also amplify its contradictions. The league's trajectory is not just its on, it is America's football. Has always mirrored the nation's identity, its ambition, its violence, its diversity, its inequality. To watch the NFL is to watch America wrestling with itself, celebrating triumph while ignoring cost, preaching values while betraying them, building empires while neglecting the vulnerable. A reckoning deferred for now, the NFL continues to thrive. Stadiums are full, ratings are strong, and Super Bowl commercials command record prices. The storm clouds of CTE politics and scandal loom, but the empire marches on. Yet history suggests that no empire is immune to reckoning. The Roman gladiators once thrilled crowds, too, until the costs became too much for a society to bear. The question is not whether the NFL will face its reckoning, but when and how. Perhaps the league will reform itself, finding a balance between spectacle and safety, profit and principle. Perhaps fans will continue to accept contradictions, choosing entertainment over ethics. Or perhaps the stories of broken bodies, silenced voices, and squandered lives will eventually overwhelm the joy of touchdowns and championships. Whatever the outcome, the NFL stands today at a crossroads, its legacy unwritten. It can be remembered as a league that embodied America's best and worst, or as a league that learned, finally, to reconcile its contradictions. The 2010s and 2020s have revealed the cracks in the shield. The final chapter will determine whether those cracks become fractures or whether, against all odds, the shield endures. The story of the NFL is not just the story of a game. It is the story of America itself. A century ago, in the mud and blood of the 1920s, men without helmets clashed on broken fields for a few dollars and the love of a crowd. They were factory workers, coal miners, farmhandsmen whose bodies were their only currency. Football then was not a business. It was survival. It was proof of toughness in a nation that demanded toughness. Those early decades forged the identity of the sport. Brutal, unrelenting, uncompromising. Players wore leather helmets that provided little more than decoration. Bones snapped, teeth shattered, and concussions went unnoticed, because there was no word for them. And yet, people came. Crowds gathered around makeshift fields, drawn not by spectacle, but by raw authenticity. This was America testing itself, seeing how much pain, how much grit, how much endurance it could bear. By the 1950s and 1960s, the NFL was no longer a backwater league. Television transformed football into a shared national ritual. Suddenly, every Sunday was a window into the drama of violence and glory. Heroes emerged: Johnny Unitas, Jim Brown, Bart Starr. The Super Bowl was born, and with it, the NFL's claim not merely to relevance, but to dominance. The sport became America's game, eclipsing baseball in popularity because it mirrored the tempo of modern life, faster, harsher, more dramatic. The 1970s hardened that image. This was the decade of the steel curtain, of blood-soaked rivalries, of defenses that treated quarterbacks like prey. It was also the decade when the NFL embraced its role as a cultural powerhouse. Monday Night Football made the game primetime theater. Players like Terry Bradshaw, Franco Harris, and Roger Staubach became household names. Football was not just sport. It was identity, woven into the fabric of American masculinity. Then came the 1980s, a decade of excess. The NFL leaned into spectacle, selling itself as entertainment as much as competition. Joe Montana orchestrated miracles. Walter Payton danced with grace. Lawrence Taylor redefined terror. ESPN and cable television replayed the violence endlessly, packaging pain as entertainment. When Joe Theismann's leg snapped on national television in 1985, millions gasped hand. Then millions kept watching. The paradox deepened. The league did not hide its brutality. It glamorized it. The 1990s and 2000s marked consolidation. The NFL was untouchable, a cultural giant. Expansion teams, sky-high contracts, billion-dollar stadium seemed there was no ceiling. Stars like Brett Favre, Emmitt Smith, Jerry Rice, and Peyton Manning became icons, their names etched into the history of sport itself. Fantasy football turned fans into quasi-owners. The Super Bowl became not just a game, but a national holiday, a shared language. But beneath the triumph, shadows lengthened. Concussions, once shrugged off as getting your bell rung, revealed themselves as silent killers. The deaths of Mike Webster, Junior Seau, and countless others forced a reckoning. Lawsuits piled up. Science exposed what the NFL had long denied. Football was not just dangerous, it was lethal. The shield that had once symbolized glory now reflected guilt. The 2010s and 2020s brought new contradictions. Players knelt during anthems, sparking political firestorms. Fans debated not only play calls, but patriotism, justice, and race. Domestic violence scandals forced questions about accountability. Billion-dollar owners grew richer, while the average player still faced a career shorter than a college degree. International expansion promised new markets even as local fans questioned the game's morality. Parents hesitated to let their children play, fearing what a lifetime of hits might mean. And yet, for all its flaws, for all its wounds, football endures. Stadiums still roar on Sundays. College campuses still erupt with chants. Kids still dream of throwing the winning touchdown, of hearing their name announced to millions. The game's grip on the American imagination has not loosened it, has only grown more complex. The dual legacy. So what is the legacy of the NFL? It is both glory and grief. It is the elegance of a perfect spiral and the horror of a shattered spine. It is the unity of millions gathered around televisions and the loneliness of a retired player who cannot remember his children's names. It is spectacle and scandal, triumph and tragedy. The shield is both a symbol of pride and a reminder of cost. To love football is to accept contradiction, to cheer knowing that the collision you celebrate might one day destroy the man who delivered it. The NFL has built its empire on that contradiction, selling violence as beauty, pain as entertainment. And America, knowingly or not, has bought in. The road ahead, the question that lingers, is not whether football will survive. It will, at least for now. The question is what kind of football it will become. Will the league embrace reform, sacrificing some of its violence to protect its players? Or will it cling to the brutality that made it great, risking public conscience for continued profit? Will it face its scandals with transparency, or bury them beneath PR campaigns? Will it empower women, minorities, and players themselves, or remain a fortress of wealthy owners guarding their billion-dollar empire? The NFL stands at a crossroads. Its past is written in mud, blood, and glory. Its future remains unwritten. The final whistle, perhaps the truest way to understand the NFL, is not to see it as a single story, but as a mirror. It mirrors America's ambition, its willingness to risk everything for success. It mirrors America's violence, its appetite for spectacle, its contradictions between ideals and realities. And it mirrors America's resilience, the ability to endure, adapt, and rise again despite every wound. 100 years from now, historians may look back at football the way we look at gladiators, awed by its spectacle, horrified by its cost. Or perhaps they will see it as the sport that reformed itself, that found a way to preserve its beauty while softening its brutality. Either way, the NFL will remain one of the great stories of our time. A story of men colliding under bright lights, cheered by millions. Their sacrifices both celebrated and forgotten. As the clock winds down on another Sunday, as fans file out of stadiums and televisions flicker dark, one truth endures. Football is never just a game. It is a reflection of who we are, what we value, and what we are willing to sacrifice in pursuit of glory. The shield gleams under the lights, but behind it lies a shadow that will follow the NFL as long as the game is played. And so the whistle blows. The field is empty. The echoes of cheers fade into night. But the questions remain unanswered, waiting for the next kickoff, the next collision, the next chapter. The story of the NFL is not over. Today has only just begun. I've spent these 15 chapters tracing a long, often brutal arc, from muddy lots where men played for a few dollars, to stadium cathedrals that broadcast violence as spectacle to millions. I began this series searching for a through line. What turned a rough, regional pastime into an empire built on collisions? The answer: painfully simple and complicated at once, is this. Football's rise depended on men who were willing and often compelled to sacrifice their bodies so the show could go on. The story isn't only about injuries and policy. It's about choices made by individuals and systems, and about what a nation values when it elevates spectacle above safety. What stays with me most is the intimacy of the cost. In every era we looked at, the toll was personal before it was institutional. A lineman's destroyed knees, a quarterback's snapped leg, a beloved veteran's light-in-life memory loss. These are not abstractions. They are the small, devastating details that eventually become patterns. Collect those patterns across decades, and you don't get a series of unfortunate events. You get a structure. One generation after another supplied the physical labor that built the NFL's brand, often without adequate protections, compensation, or aftercare. That structural fact is the moral center of this story. There are truths that I cannot ignore. The league's evolution delivered extraordinary beauty, joy, and meaning to millions. I am moved by the brilliance of a perfectly timed pass, by the communal release of a comeback, by the way the game binds families across generations. I am also moved by the men who made those moments possible. Not merely the headlines, but the anonymous laborers in the trenches whose stories rarely make the highlight reel. My admiration for the spectacle does not erase the obligation to reckon with the price paid to create it. The patterns repeat. Scarcity pushes men into harm's way. Cultural ideals of toughness normalize silence. Commercial demand rewards spectacle. Institutions worship continuity and profit while delaying accountability. Across the 1920s and 1930s, economic desperation made pain the currency of survival. Through the mid-century, television transformed violence into a consumable aesthetic. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought fortune and scale. And with them, a crisis the league could not indefinitely manage away. The science of brain injury. The moral calculus of labor and reward, and the social politics of who gets to speak and who gets to decide. This series has insisted on two hard-related conclusions. First, reforms that sanitize imagery without changing incentives are insufficient. It matters that the league tightened rules and upgraded helmets. It matters even more that the incentives for owners, coaches, and players shift toward long-term health. Second, the people most affected by the game's risks. Players, their families, and communities that feed the pipeline must have meaningful power over the structures that govern their lives and livelihoods. Cosmetic change without structural redistribution is at best temporary and, at worst, performative. Practical reform is not a simple moral demand. It is a program of policy choices. We can start by reordering economic risk, guaranteed contracts, expanded pensions, and credible long-term care for those who pay the price. We can insist on truly independent medical oversight, staffed by clinicians whose primary duty is to the patient, not to the team's immediate competitive needs. We can accelerate research funding for brain health and make those data transparently available. We can redesign youth pathways so children learn safer tackling techniques and have informed consent about the risks. None of these are improbable. They require commitment and a willingness to accept trade-offs. Sometimes the trade-off will be a different kind of game than the one we've always loved. There is also a cultural work to be done. The tacit code that equates toughness with silence needs dismantling. Valor should not be measured solely by pain tolerated, but by the wisdom to preserve a life beyond the field. We must honor those who stay and those who walk away without moralizing either choice. Moreover, the league must reconcile its promotional instincts with its ethical obligations. If profit follows spectacle, leadership must be judged on how it tempers spectacle to protect people. Race and power are part of the story too. The majority of players are black, the majority of owners are not. That asymmetry shapes everything from how protests are perceived to whose suffering triggers reform. The Kaepernick episode taught us that cultural visibility does not automatically yield moral change. In many cases, it yields backlash and conditional acceptance. If the NFL wants genuine progress on inclusion and justice, it must move beyond symbolic gestures and toward substantive shifts in decision-making power and accountability. Finally, endings matter. This series closes not because the story is finished, but because the moment for decision is upon us. Empires built on deferred consequences eventually face the bill. The NFL has time, resources, and cultural capital to choose a different path, one where the game's beauty is retained while human costs are minimized and fairly compensated. That will require painful choices, narrower definitions of permissible violence, different business models for youth development, more power for players in governance, and a willingness from fans to accept a sport that may look different than the one of mid-century myth. I don't pretend to know exactly how the NFL will answer these questions. Institutions change under pressure, and sometimes only change when the political and economic tides make transformation less costly than stasis. What I believe is this: if the league chooses transparency over pretense, restitution over deflection, and partnership over paternalism, it will survive not merely as entertainment, but as a healthier institution, one that can be proud of how it treats the people who make it possible. If it chooses otherwise, the contradiction between spectacle and cost will widen until fans, players, and civic institutions demand a reckoning it can no longer deny. In the end, the game we love is a test of values. We can marvel at the ferocity of a perfectly executed play, and still ask whether that ferocity should be the currency of our culture. We can celebrate the moments that lift us and still stand in solidarity with the men who broke themselves to create those moments. The choice before us is simple in formulation, difficult in practice. Do we keep the shield shining while hiding the shadow? Or do we bring the shadow into the light and change what the shield represents? My hope is neither nostalgia for a mythic past nor blind enthusiasm for revenue and spectacle. My hope is for a football that honors its heroes by protecting them, for a league that measures success not only in ratings and revenue, but in the physical and moral health of its people. That, to me, would be a championship worth winning. As the lights dim and the field falls silent, the echoes remain. They are the laughter of fans, the silence of empty locker rooms, the voices of men whose memories slip like sand. Those echoes are a call. They ask us to remember, to reckon, and to act. The game goes on. How we carry its cost will tell us who we are.